Chapter 490. In the mysterious and chaotic Northern Europe, for hundreds of years, even the children who had just become sensible knew the legends about darkness that were circulating in Northern Europe. Darkness was everywhere. The rich black slowly penetrated into every corner of Northern Europe in the deepest and heaviest way. The Nordic Council, governments, special warfare organizations, major enterprises, military industry, finance, intelligence, transportation, clothing, food, housing, transportation, and even daily necessities. Everything in Northern Europe had a vague shadow of darkness. And the source of all this was the dark world, which also lay in faith. There were also many extremely devout believers of the Vatican in Northern Europe. In the eyes of believers, this was a place where it was extremely difficult for the glory of God to spread. In this area, every year, members of the Vatican above the level of bishop would be killed, nuns would disappear for no reason, and churches would be attacked. All of this was because there was darkness here. Very few people knew what the so-called darkness was. It was a person. It was a business or a religion. Ordinary people couldn't describe it specifically, so darkness became a legend. Only people in the dark world knew that the darkness in Northern Europe, to be exact, was a force. A force with a long and ancient heritage. Elite, tough, mysterious, cold-blooded, powerful and gloomy. They might be evil, but no one could deny their strength and influence on Northern Europe. This was a group of knights who traveled alone in the dark. People called them the Dark Knights, and the commander of the Dark Knights in the Northern European legend was the famous Light Crusher. Raphael Wilson, the commander of the Dark Knights. In Northern Europe, this name was like a nightmare, and his code name was Nightmare. A man who had attacked the Vatican many times for decades, involved nearly half of the elites of the Holy Disarmament Corps of the Vatican in Northern Europe, and could even escape from Arcis unscathed. In other words, Raphael Wilson, the commander of the Dark Knights, was the biggest heretic in the eyes of the Vatican in recent decades. In the hundreds of years of history of the Dark Knights, Raphael might not be the strongest commander, but he did single-handedly raise the status of the Dark Knights to the peak. When the Dark Saint Spear, one of the 12 murderous weapons, could be fired, Raphael was almost fearless in the dark world with the Dark Saint Spear in his hand. The Dark Saint Spear fired 3 years ago. It was still in the charging period. And the main reason why the Dark Saint Spear opened fire was for the Samsara Palace, or the Master of Samsara Palace. Now that Li Tianlan could face Qin Weibai's identity, he naturally knew some of the past and secrets of the Samsara Palace and the Dark Knights. For him, as long as he still trusted Qin Weibai, he would not doubt Raphael. On the night of August 17th, when the whole Reki city was in turmoil, it was also the first time that Li Tianlan saw the commander of the Dark Knights, whom he had known for a long time. Raphael was less than 50 years old this year. He was considered young among the experts of the Invincible Realm, and he looked even younger. This famous nightmare in Northern Europe was a Eurasian. He was tall and slender, handsome and well-defined. He looked like a young man in his 30s. His every move was full of power. This was a man who was extremely charming in both appearance and temperament. He was neither overbearing nor cold. His smile was very kind, but it was not fake. It was a kind of natural sincerity and calmness. Your Highness Raphael, I'm Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan bowed slightly and said in a calm tone. Raphael did not have the slightest arrogance of an expert on the divine list. He also bowed slightly and said with a gentle smile, It's the first time we've met. Marshal Li, you're really outstanding. Li Tianlan raised his eyebrows. Dongqing Rushi, who was behind him and paying attention to the conversation, was a little surprised. Because Raphael was using Chinese. And it was the most standard Mandarin. His pronunciation was clear and casual, without any accent. Zhongzhou State was the most powerful country in the world. All countries were learning Chinese. There were many foreigners who could speak Chinese, but foreigners who could speak such standard Mandarin were extremely rare. Moreover, although Raphael was a Eurasian, the information showed that he was the descendant of a French and a Japanese woman. He had nothing to do with Zhongzhou State at all. But now, Dongqing Rushi even suspected that Raphael's Japanese might not be as good as his Chinese. Your Chinese is very good. Li Tianlan smiled and praised him. I like Zhongzhou State. It's the most mysterious and powerful place in the world. But unfortunately, I didn't have any friends in Zhongzhou State before, and no one welcomed me there. Raphael laughed softly. He was sitting in a somewhat dark hall. The light was very dim, but his voice was very warm. Friend? Now you have one. Li Tianlan nodded. After the matter in Eastern Europe is over, I hope that your Highness can come to Zhongzhou State to have a look. At that time, I will personally be your tour guide. Ha! Raphael laughed happily, and the constant roar became clearer and clearer in his laughter. The roar came from Li Tianlan's side and from the other side of the screen. This meant that Raphael was also very close to the Caesar Hotel. Raphael glanced out of the window and suddenly said thoughtfully, Marshal Li, Reki City is very lively tonight. Yes, Prime Minister Rieker talked to me. It is said that there is a group of terrorists in the Caesar Hotel who intend to overthrow the rule of the entire Wulan state. Since Prime Minister Rieker got the news, he must crack down on them. Li Tianlan talked nonsense with a serious face. He was indeed talking nonsense. Raphael also knew that, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that it was a reason. This kind of reason didn't even need to be true or false. It only needed to be reasonable. In Reki City, the Prime Minister of Wulan State was reasonable. He thought that the Shadow Throne was a terrorist and sent troops directly. This was also reasonable. Raphael was silent for a while, then nodded and smiled. Prime Minister Rieker is very bold, and Marshal Li is also very generous. Li Tianlan lowered his head and lit a cigarette. In the smoke, he was silent for a while and suddenly said, But now it seems that our preparation is not enough. Things are too hasty. At present, Prime Minister Rieker has encountered some difficulties. Raphael looked at Li Tianlan quietly. He did not avoid any topic and asked straightforwardly, What do you need me to do? His voice was calm and direct, as if he was ready for anything. Even though Li Tianlan knew that the other party was really one of his own, he did not expect that Raphael would be so straightforward. He was slightly stunned and said softly, Your Highness, if you can rush to the Caesar Hotel now, I can guarantee that the Dark Knights will get the greatest kindness from Wulan State. Raphael was stunned and said hesitantly, Now? He was not hesitating but a little worried. He looked at Li Tianlan sincerely and said, Is it too hasty? Time is of the essence. I have no choice. Li Tianlan said softly. Raphael took a deep look at Li Tianlan and said, I'll take someone there myself. Li Tianlan nodded silently and said calmly, Well, the Snowdance Corps is currently. Raphael waved his hand with a smile, stood up and said, Since time is of the essence, there's no need to give me a reason. I'll go there now. Marshal Li, I believe in you. Li Tianlan silently put out the cigarette butt. On the screen, Raphael, the commander of the Dark Knights, had turned around and was ready to leave. Li Tianlan bowed deeply to the screen and said calmly, Thank you, brother-in-law. He now had two brothers-in-law. The first brother-in-law was still in Jiangxia. He was Zhou Yuanshan, who had taken the first crucial step in the next 20 years. He was Dongqing Rushi's brother-in-law. The second was Raphael, the commander of the Dark Knights. This was Qin Weibai's brother-in-law, who was Qin Weibai's sister. The whole Dark World knew. But no one knew that the Dark Knights, who would stand with the Samsara Palace at the critical moment, were usually aloof and even had occasional conflicts with the Samsara Palace, would have such a close relationship with the Samsara Palace. Raphael paused for a moment and finally burst out laughing. This middle-aged man, who looked elegant and gentle, laughed so heartily for the first time. Perhaps Li Tianlan himself didn't know how important the word brother-in-law was to Raphael. Raphael strode out of the dark hall. He was now less than 6 or 7 kilometers away from the Caesar Hotel. He temporarily lived in an ordinary hotel apartment, and there were no elites of the Dark Knights around him. There were only a few high-level members of the Dark Knights who had followed him from Northern Europe. Outside the hall was a larger hall. In front of the huge French window, several high-level members of the Dark Knights were gathered together, discussing the occasional artillery fire in the night sky with great interest. Raphael stood in front of the railing and took a look. Suddenly he said, "Sin." There was a moment of silence in the hall. Among the high-level members, an extremely thin old man in a tuxedo, who looked to be in his 50s, turned around, bowed, and said respectfully, "Your Highness. It's time to take action." Raphael said softly, "Mobilize people from the base and enter Reki City as fast as possible. Tonight, we will destroy the Shadow Throne." Only at this moment did he really look like the commander of the Dark Knights, the biggest heretic of the Vatican, instead of the brother-in-law who would grant Li Tianlan's request just now. Everyone was shocked. "How many people should we mobilize?" Sin asked subconsciously. He was now the most senior Dark Knight in the Dark Knights. He had been in the Dark Knights for even longer than Raphael. As the top expert of the half-step invincible realm, his status could be said to be second only to the commander. "All of them," Raphael said lightly. Sin seemed to be too shocked and didn't speak for a while. "Your Highness," an extremely rough figure took a step forward, and his voice became a little cautious. "It's too urgent." He was also one of the high-level members of the Dark Knights. His code name was Fury. More than 3 years ago, before and after the final battle of Heaven Capital broke out, it was Fury who led the team to the Sky Academy with the Dark Saint Spear and witnessed the battle between the Master of Samsara Palace and Gu Xingyun. Raphael glanced at him, nodded, and said, "If we take action later, maybe we can get more," another high-level member said softly. His voice was a little hoarse. His code name was Greed, and what he said was very consistent with his code name. "Maybe we should take a break now. It will be better for us to go there when we have the spirit?" A lazy voice. This was the laziness of the Dark Knights. Fury, greed, arrogance, sloth, envy, gluttony, desire. Nightmare Raphael. This was the list of the top high-level members of the Dark Knights. Raphael listened quietly to their opinions. When everyone finished speaking, he said calmly, "Are you done?" All the high-level members looked at each other and nodded at the same time. "Then let's take action." Raphael waved his hand. Everyone said, "Oh," and stood up at the same time. Even Sloth, the laziest one, stood up with a sigh. Raphael looked at them quietly without saying a word. Just now, everyone's opposition was not really opposition. The atmosphere of the Dark Knights was like this. They just said what they wanted to say. As the leader, Raphael did not change his mind, so everyone could only take action. "Your Highness, we will take a lot of risks." Sin reminded him one last time. Raphael said, expressionless. Sin sighed softly, took out his mobile phone, and began to call the base of the Dark Knights in Wulan State. The Dark Knights weren't called the Dark Knights in the beginning, but I've long forgotten the original name of this organization. At first, we were like other forces, pursuing money and power. Even now, it's still the same. It's just that in the beginning, we touched the interests of the Vatican, so we became heretics. In desperation, we began to rebel against the Vatican. Raphael's voice was calm. "But the Vatican has faith. What about us? Our greatest faith is to go against the Vatican, but what kind of faith is that? We also believe in the Almighty God. What we oppose is only the Vatican. So from this point of view, we are still the same as other forces. What we pursue is money and wealth. Resisting the Vatican is our instinct and also for survival. I don't like this kind of life. The darkness without passion is the most disgusting. Everyone, the Dark Knights will not take any risks, because it will always exist. But, in the battle tonight, I can be sure that I am doing something more important than my life. I am doing it for my love. Apart from that, I have no other purpose. Now I ask you to help me. After tonight, maybe I will die and you will die, but the darkness will always exist." The hall became quieter and quieter. Raphael ignored anyone's response. He lowered his head, took out his mobile phone, and made a call. The call was quickly connected. A slight breathing sound came from the phone, so gentle. Raphael laughed. His eyes and smile became so soft. "I'll go to the Caesar Hotel right away," Raphael said softly. The voice on the phone was silent for a while before asking softly. Raphael chuckled and said, Tianlong is looking for me. How can I refuse his brother-in-law's request as his brother-in-law? There was silence on the phone. I'm here too. The female voice on the phone said softly. Then I have to go even more. Raphael said with a smile, no matter what, I have to protect my woman. After a long silence, the master of Samsara Palace said softly on the phone. Raphael's smile was intoxicating, as gentle as wine. After this matter is over, I will agree to your request. On the phone, the voice of the master of Samsara Palace became soft. Raphael nodded with a smile. So, the master of Samsara Palace muttered to herself, you have to live. Wang Tianzong was also on the phone. The Snowdance Corps could be said to be the most elite army in the world, but Wang Tianzong was also the most powerful sword emperor in the dark world today. If he wanted to break out of the encirclement, it would not be difficult for him to leave here. The most difficult thing was that Li Tianlong occupied the general trend. At least in the general direction, Wang Tianzong and the Snowdance Corps had the same position. They were both forces that belonged to Zhongzhou State. It was impossible for Wang Tianzong to give up the support of Zhongzhou State, so it was impossible for him to fight his way out of the Snowdance Corps. The imprisonment was already a foregone conclusion. Wang Tianzong, who had tasted the feeling of being imprisoned for the first time in his life, returned to his room by himself, but he didn't look angry. Li Tianlong imprisoned his freedom, but he didn't cut off his right to communicate with the outside world. Both sides took a step back. After all, neither Wang Tianzong nor Li Tianlong wanted to drive each other completely crazy. Wang Tianzong had already called King Tong. He even called all the high-level officials he could find in the Shadow Throne. But there was no response. There was no doubt that the signal near the Caesar Hotel had been completely blocked. For now, Wang Tianzong, who had no way to deal with it, calmed down completely and called summer solstice. It was already the morning of August 18th in Zhongzhou State. Summer solstice's call was quickly connected. There was complete silence on the other side of the phone. There was no sound of the waves hitting the cliff, nor was there any soft music when she was playing with flowers and plants. Only summer solstice's light footsteps and her voice sounded, which were extremely clear. I heard about it. Summer solstice took the initiative to say, he did a very clever job this time, and everything is reasonable. Tianzong, no matter how unwilling you are, you can't do anything before you have the right opportunity. Wang Tianzong nodded with a smile and said calmly, I didn't intend to do anything. I'll just wait for the opportunity. Summer solstice replied softly. After a moment of silence, she whispered, if you can break through, it will be the best opportunity. Wang Tianzong whispered, before, I was still considering whether to be quiet or to move. Now I can't move even if I want to. Fate has given me a choice, and I have no reason to refuse. Summer solstice was silent. Her soft footsteps rang for a long time, and then she whispered, Tianzong, it's very uncomfortable, isn't it? The dignified sword emperor was imprisoned by a young man who was like an ant in his eyes in terms of strength and background. When had Wang Tianzong ever suffered such humiliation? Summer solstice thought of the entanglement between her daughter and Li Tianlong, and her heart became more and more complicated. Wang Tianzong smiled and said, I mean it. I'm very close to breaking through. The environment of the office of the president is good. I don't think anyone will disturb me on weekdays. I can take advantage of this period of time to calm down. The outside world is in turmoil, and the situation is chaotic. I'm in the middle of it, and I can't stay still or move. To be honest, it's better to do it now. It's good that you can figure it out. Summer solstice chuckled. Wang Tianzong was silent for a while before he whispered, Solstice, do something. You can't come to Eastern Europe, but you can contact our country and Rothschild. After tonight, no matter what happens to the Shadow Throne, King Tong must live. This is my bottom line, my bottom line. Summer solstice was silent for a while and whispered, okay, leave it to me. Wang Tianzong seemed to be completely relieved. He narrowed his eyes and did not speak for a long time. King Tong must live. This was his bottom line. This sentence was said to the high-level officials of Zhongzhou State. He was wondering if he should say it to Li Tianlan. He was imprisoned here now because he had to take care of the overall situation. But if Li Tianlan insisted on trampling on his bottom line regardless of the overall situation, Wang Tianzong would naturally take action. This was not a threat. It was just a means of gambling. "I'll leave for Yuzhou in the afternoon." Summer Solstice said slowly, "You'd better communicate with Li Tianlan. He is a little lunatic. If you don't suppress him, King Tong will be in trouble." "I know." Wang Tianzong nodded and suddenly said, "Where are you now?" "On the way to the 6th lab." Summer Solstice said calmly. Wang Tianzong fell silent. In the 6th lab. That was the sword-forging room of the Wang family of Beihai. It was also the place to debug the murderous weapon, Human Emperor. He narrowed his eyes slightly and said calmly, "How's the sword?" "It's almost the same as you." Summer Solstice was a little helpless. Wang Tianzong also smiled bitterly. The famous sword of the Wang family of Beihai, Listen to the Sea, shocked the dark world. However, after Wang Tianzong approached the peak of the invincible realm, Listen to the Sea had gradually become inconvenient because Wang Tianzong's sword intent was too strong. Now that Wang Tianzong had surpassed the peak of the invincible realm, he increasingly felt that Listen to the Sea was not as powerful as he wanted. So the Wang family of Beihai started the sword forging plan. The sword forging plan had started earlier. This time, it was just a repetition of the plan from more than 20 years ago. Few people knew that as early as more than 20 years ago, the Wang family of Beihai wanted to build a real peerless magic weapon with its own hands. Or it could be said that it was the real sword of the Chosen One that could perfectly bear the sword intent of the Chosen One. And this time, the swordsmithing project would use the sword embryo that had consumed countless precious materials back then. However, at the beginning of that sword, its owner was not Wang Tianzong. It was a person who was really hopeful and had a great chance to become the chosen one of the present age. Summer Solstice. This was originally a sword forged for summer solstice. Now Wang Tianzong restarted the sword embryo. He wanted to get a sword that could perfectly bear his sword intent when he broke through the last step. "What's the suggestion of the 6th lab?" Wang Tianzong asked slowly. "Our requirements are too high. The peerless magic weapon naturally needs spirituality. In other words, the sword of the Chosen One should be a sword with life. However, the infinite sky was shattered too seriously back then, and it almost lost all its activity. Its spirituality is somewhat insufficient. The only way." Summer Solstice was silent for a while. Wang Tianzong also fell silent. There were few weapons with life, but they were not non-existent. In the dark world, there were now 12 weapons with life. Wang Tianzong narrowed his eyes and whispered, "You mean, if this sword is completed, it needs to crush the Human Emperor?" "At present, this sword needs the spirituality of the Human Emperor." On the other end of the phone, Summer Solstice pushed open the door of the 6th lab. The 6th lab was extremely desolate. In a huge ancient bronze tripod, a thick and broad sword was inserted in it, being tested by various instruments. This was an extremely huge and thick long sword. The long sword was black, 2 meters long, and the blade was very wide. It looked extremely majestic and solemn. Countless patterns were carved on both sides of the black blade. One side of the blade was carved with the sun, the moon, and the stars. The other side of the blade was carved with mountains, rivers, lakes, and seas. The huge blade was inserted there quietly, but it seemed to carry the whole world. This was a real peerless magic blade. The sword of the Chosen One. "Tianzong, I'm looking forward to the day when you break through. With this sword, you can sweep through the chaotic world." Summer Solstice walked to the black sword, gently stroked the blade, and said in a gentle tone. This was a famous sword that was close to completion. After adding the murderous weapon, the Human Emperor, Summer Solstice fully believed that this would be a new perfect sword that could protect the prosperity of the Wang family of Beihai for hundreds of years. Summer Solstice had thought of the name of this sword a long time ago. This sword. It was called Coldness of 9 States. About the master of Samsara Palace, from her first appearance to this chapter, it seems contradictory, but in fact, there is no contradiction. All the holes about the Samsara Palace will be filled in this volume. About the master of Samsara Palace, pay attention to Qin Wei Bai, everything. Chapter 491. Summer Solstice hung up the phone. Soon, Wang Tianzong received a video call from Summer Solstice on his mobile phone. Wang Tianzong connected his mobile phone to the screen in the room, and the screen lit up instantly. But what appeared in front of Wang Tianzong was not the face that could calm him the most. It was the huge black sword with the sun, moon, stars, mountains, lakes, and seas carved on both sides of the blade. The black sword stood on the huge bronze tripod, silent, solemn, majestic, heavy as a mountain, but with unparalleled sharpness. Many famous swords in the world would make people think of many things, good or bad, big or small. But the shape of this sword was so simple. It was a pure sword, just a sword, without any adjectives. Because of its purity, the sword looked perfect without any flaws. The sword energy traveled 30,000 miles, and the cold light of the sword suppressed 9 states. Coldness of 9 states. Wang Tianzong narrowed his eyes and looked at the sword on the screen. He was silent for a long time. His eyes were no longer calm or passionate, but with a kind of extremely focused trust and desire. Inside and outside the screen, thousands of miles away, mountains, rivers, and seas. The invincible sword emperor. The perfect swords were silent. They seemed to be looking at each other quietly. This is the real invincible sword. Wang Tianzong was silent for a long time before he slowly opened his mouth. No one could deny that. Once this sword was born, some people might not recognize Wang Tianzong, but no one would not recognize the coldness of 9 states. Perfection was supposed to be accepted, acknowledged, and even admired and revered by everyone. But it can be more perfect. Summer Solstice's voice sounded off the screen. No one knew whether she was stimulated by the sword energy or other reasons. Although her voice was still gentle, it was a little cold. Wang Tianzong stared at the screen and did not speak for a while. A perfect sword needed spirituality and even its own thoughts. The murderous weapon human emperor, or any murderous weapon, could be said to be a weapon with its own thoughts. The main material for the Wang family of Beihai to cast the coldness of 9 states came from the murderous weapon Infinite Sky that was broken more than 20 years ago. Kunlun City, which had always been eager to have its own murderous weapon, had been collecting materials of Infinite Sky in recent years. In the Battle of Lin, and not long ago, Gu Xingyun was seriously injured by Situ Cangyue's Setting Sunday. That shot was also equivalent to surrendering the dominance of Setting Sunday. After that, Setting Sun was brought back to Kunlun City. Kunlun City, which had a murderous weapon, felt that it was not interesting to study the Infinite Sky again. However, the materials from Endless Sky were also of great value. These materials were sent to the Wang family of Beihai. The condition was that the Wang family of Beihai should take the lead in the action against Li Tianlan in the chaos in Eastern Europe. Therefore, when the Snowdance Corps went north, the vice-marshal of the Snowdance Corps was Qin Qingluan. This was a transaction. Both sides were worth it. This transaction also allowed the coldness of the 9 states to enter its final stage. But a broken murderous weapon was still broken. The Endless Sky had almost completely lost its activity. Naturally, it could not compare to a murderous weapon at its peak. The human emperor was the weapon of the Wang family of Beihai that had been passed down for hundreds of years. It could make the coldness of the 9 states completely perfect. However, once the coldness of 9 states was perfected, it meant that there would be no more human emperors in the Dark World. The new coldness of the 9 states might still possess all the functions of a human sovereign, but its primary function was the sword. Moreover, even if it possessed the functions of a human sovereign, the coldness of the 9 states would only be the coldness of the 9 states, not the human sovereign. Do you have any suggestions? Wang Tianzong suddenly asked. I use a sword, so I only believe in the sword. Summer Solstice replied softly. The human sovereign was a spear. Its power was the best in the Dark World. Even in the hands of an ordinary invincible realm expert, it could instantly burst out the power of a peak invincible realm expert or even beyond the peak invincible realm expert. This was an extremely terrifying trump card of the Wang family of Beihai. Powerful, mysterious, with a strong aura of death. But the human sovereign was not perfect, because its charging period was too long. However, during the time when the human sovereign was still charging, Wang Tianzong could only hold Listen to the Sea. Listen to the Sea was a famous sword. But today, in Wang Tianzong's realm, Listen to the Sea was no longer trustworthy. Wang Tianzong took another look at the coldness of the 9 states on the screen. Summer solstice started the giant bronze tripod. The huge bronze tripod began to spin. The dark sword body was also spinning. The sun, moon, stars, mountains, lakes, and seas carved on the blade became more vivid and heavy. When the blade turned, it seemed to be the entire Wang family of Beihai. The sky and the sea. Wang Tianzong stared at the coldness of the 9 states seriously. After a long time, he nodded and said, "I agree." It was from this moment on. The era when the Wang family of Beihai shocked the world with the power of the human sovereign finally began to end. The future of the Wang family of Beihai would be on the sword edge of the coldness of the 9 states. The sword energy was 30,000 miles long. One sword could suppress 9 states. Wang Tianzong silently hung up the video call. Both the human sovereign and the coldness of the 9 states would be recast tonight. With absolutely precious materials. With the human sovereign and the wreckage of the endless sky. With the technology of the Wang family of Beihai, the coldness of the 9 states would become a unique world-shaking sword in the dark world in the shortest time. But the human sovereign was gone. Wang Tianzong closed his eyes and felt the subtle gain and loss. He was silent for a long time. He even began to recall the path he had taken. From childhood, to the past, to the present, and to the future. He thought of the glory when he held the human sovereign. He thought of the silence and loss when he was learning swordsmanship in his childhood. He thought of the feeling of being at a loss when he first entered the invincible realm, instead of being high-spirited. But what he thought more was how to lead the future of the Wang family of Beihai with the coldness of the 9 states in his hand without the descendant of the human sovereign. He was in the office of the president now. He was invincible in the world. There were many of his opponents. Deity, Lin Fengting, Qin Weibai, Li Tianlan, and all the super forces. Wang Tianzong finally admitted this. No one in the dark world was his opponent now. But in the general trend, everyone who could dominate the situation here was his opponent. At this moment, Wang Tianzong seemed to have walked down from the throne he had been sitting for a long time and finally found his humbleness. He put himself in the same position as everyone else. His mind was extremely clear and his heart was in awe. Perhaps even Wang Tianzong himself did not know how terrifying he would be when he lowered his posture and observed everything carefully. In the end, he thought of the coldness of the 9 states that had never been born. The sword emperor that was infinitely close to the chosen one. The divine sword that was infinitely close to perfection. Neither was worthy. They did not match. Both the sword and the man should be one step closer. Wang Tianzong's eyes became calm. Outside the office of the president, the roar that shook the whole city had gradually disappeared. But the whole Reki city was getting more and more chaotic. Countless people roared and screamed wildly. The messy gunshots pierced through the wind and rain and entered his ears. Wang Tianzong slowly closed the window, turned around, sat on the bed, and began to meditate. He had no way to leave here now. The war was still going on in the outside world. But there was no real result, so no one touched his bottom line for the time being. As long as King Tong was alive, Wang Tianzong could accept this failure. It was useless to think too much. The only thing he could do now was to cultivate. And cultivation was the only thing he could do in his life. There was often only a thin line between heaven and hell. The same was true for wealth and poverty. Mandy Street was a famous slum in Reki City. It was huge, chaotic, and dirty. Closely connected to Mandy Street was the most luxurious Lair Street in Reki City. Lair Street had the most spacious streets and the most luxurious buildings in Reki City. It also gathered the most wealth. The Caesar Hotel, one of the most luxurious hotels in Reki City, was located in Lair Street. The two blocks were closely connected, so most of the time, sitting in any corner of Mandy Street and looking up, one could see the brilliant lights of the luxurious Caesar Hotel. On the stormy night of August 17th, the lights of the Caesar Hotel disappeared. Chaotic explosions and war broke out abruptly. Countless people in Mandy Street, who usually made a living at the bottom of Reki City, had fled to different blocks in chaos. There were fewer and fewer people in Mandy Street. In the end, there were only two very narrow houses that still had a faint light. These two families could be said to be the newest residents in Mandy Street. There were no more than 12 people in the two families. There were men and women, and their behavior was a little strange. They had been here for nearly a month, but all the residents nearby had never heard them say a word. Such indifference was not only to outsiders. Even their own people did not speak at all. Many people thought they were mutes. However, such a strange thing that was enough to attract a lot of people's attention in ordinary days had not been noticed at all in the past month. The chaos in Eastern Europe had broken out. All of Eastern Europe, even the civilians, were paying attention to the fate of Eastern Europe. Who would be willing to listen to the stories behind a dozen or so Asian mute people? The residents of Mandy Street were running for their lives amidst the loud explosions. The two houses with lights still on were still quiet. There were fewer and fewer people in the slums. In the end, the lights in the two houses also began to go out. The street was dead silent. In the extinguished lights, the 12 mutes, who had aroused the curiosity of many people, were still standing in their rooms, looking in the direction of the Caesar Hotel. The Caesar Hotel had completely disappeared, but the strong smell of gunpowder gradually spread to Mandy Street. Amidst the silence, a mechanical voice suddenly sounded, "Action?" After a short silence, another voice sounded, "Wait." The conversation ended. The long silence continued to elapse. 10 minutes, half an hour, an hour. No one spoke. The living room was so quiet that there was no sound of breathing. "Action." Another voice abruptly rang out. Before anyone spoke, a signal that was hard to see with the naked eye suddenly spread in the air. The 12 figures standing quietly in the darkness instantly froze for a moment. In the silent darkness, beams of incomparably demonic red light suddenly shot out one after another. The red light shot out from their left eyes. It was half a meter long and scarlet. Everyone's left eyes lit up one by one. The eyeball and the white of the eye completely disappeared in their eyes. Complex signals flickered in their eyes one after another, corresponding to extremely complex codes. The process lasted about half a minute. The red light began to disappear, but the data in everyone's eyes was still rolling. It was not really an eyeball. It was an instrument implanted in their eye sockets, an instrument that could communicate and give orders. The darkness quieted down again. However, the surrounding atmosphere suddenly became incomparably gloomy. The data rolled, and the eyeball of the instrument made a beeping sound. Everyone took a step forward at the same time. This time, no one asked anything. The 12 people said in unison at the same time, "Action." It was 10 o'clock in the evening on August 17th in Eastern Europe. The date of death had just passed. The trial day had not yet arrived. In the war that broke out abruptly, in the wind and rain that covered everything, the devil had arrived. Chapter 492. The Caesar Hotel, which had been turned into ruins, became extremely quiet. When the roar temporarily disappeared, there seemed to be only the sound of messy rain and hurried footsteps in the whole city. King Tong stood where she was and stared coldly at the army of Wulan state in front of her. The domain belonging to the invincible realm shrank slowly but extremely sharply in front of her. The domain rolled up the rain in the air. Pieces of rain kept exploding above her and turned into sword intent. The sword intent fell on the ground and turned into broken ice. Reki City, which was already cold, became colder and colder, like deep winter. The elites of the Shadow Throne began to gather quickly toward King Tong. The smell of blood in the ruins had been washed away by the rain, and more elites gathered behind King Tong. A kind of almost crazy killing intent and rage kept spreading behind King Tong. This was the anger of the entire Shadow Throne. Endless anger was surging, as if it was going to burn the entire Reki city. The army surrounded, the missiles bombed, and the fighter jets swept. Wulan State was extremely determined to do everything to the Shadow Throne. From the beginning to the end, everything the military did was to kill them all. There was no probing. From the beginning, the military used the most terrifying means. The most direct way of action had the greatest effect. Under the cover of the fiercest artillery fire, the elites of the Shadow Throne in the Caesar Hotel suffered extremely heavy losses in an instant. But this also completely infuriated the entire Shadow Throne. More and more elites gathered behind King Tong, and the strong killing intent seemed to freeze the whole night sky. The army in the front row of Wulan State was slightly restless. King Tong, who had been silent, suddenly said, "Let Riker come out to see me." Her voice was neither soft nor sharp, and the volume was neither high nor low, but the magnetic voice spread throughout the whole place in an instant. The army of Wulan State was silent. King Tong narrowed her eyes, raised the corners of her mouth slightly, and looked disdainful. Her appearance and figure were both extremely enchanting. Normally, she would not deliberately display such charm. However, at this moment, she stood there with a haughty look on her face. Her entire person exuded an enchanting charm that could steal one's soul. "I know that your Prime Minister doesn't dare to come out. From the day the Snowdance Corps entered Reki City, I knew that your Prime Minister was a good-for-nothing." King Tong stared at the army in front of her and said in a cold and arrogant tone, "I want to see your commander." The only response he got was silence. King Tong, whose eyes were full of coldness and fury, showed great patience and waited for the other party's response without saying a word. It was hard to tell whether it was a short or long silence. She quietly shifted her gaze and looked around. Many people in the dark world could see the truth of the great change in Reki City. But the truth was never important in the dark world. King Tong did not expect to persuade the tens of thousands of troops of Wulan State in front of her. What she was doing now was very simple. He was stalling for time. Wang Tianzong had been to the office of the president for a long time. At this time, even if he could not take down Li Tianlan, the roar of countless cannons could always make him realize what was going on here. Calculating the time, if he had rushed back as soon as the sound of gunfire sounded, he should have arrived by now. In Reki City, Wang Tianzong was the only ally King Tong could count on. The Shadow Throne had a secret base outside Reki City, and there were also a large number of elites in it. But the distance between the two sides was too far. It would take at least 2 hours for them to get here after receiving the news. So all her hopes were on Wang Tianzong. It was not because Wang Tianzong was here and it would be easy for her to break out of the encirclement, but because Wang Tianzong and Li Tianlan seemed to have the same position. Everything tonight was done by the military of Wulan State. But they must have followed the will of the Snowdance Corps. Moreover, the other party's action was so resolute, which meant that Li Tianlan was very likely to have woken up. For tonight, he had even been planning for a long time. All King Tong saw now was the army of Wulan State. But if all this was done by Li Tianlan, she could not be sure what would be waiting for her later. King Tong did not know Li Tianlan very well, but she roughly knew his style of doing things. This young man, who had just stepped onto the top stage of the dark world, might have many shortcomings, such as lack of experience. His mind might not be meticulous enough, but his means were crazy enough. King Tong thought that if she broke out of the encirclement now, the consequences would be unpredictable. But if Wang Tianzong could be here, everything would be different. Because Zhongzhou State would not watch Li Tianlan attack Wang Tianzong. Just like how Zhongzhou State would not watch Wang Tianzong attack Li Tianlan. If Wang Tianzong was here, everything tonight would probably be a negotiation. Perhaps King Tong would have to make compensation for what happened tonight, which was undoubtedly a very aggrieved thing. But compared with the upcoming bloody battle, preserving strength was undoubtedly the most important thing. King Tong waited silently. She liked Wang Tianzong like crazy, and she had liked him for many years. That was the man she admired the most, trusted the most, and relied on the most invisibly. She believed that Wang Tianzong would rush over. It was nothing more than a step earlier or a step later. So now she stood here, deterred these ordinary troops with the power that she had burst out in an instant, and then tried her best to delay the time and wait for Wang Tianzong to come to the rescue. Time passed slowly. Minutes and seconds. The army of Wulan State became more and more restless. But Wang Tianzong never showed up. King Tong's firm eyes began to waver, and she became absent-minded. She put her expectations on another person, but she did not get the expected result. There were only two possibilities. First, the other party could not do it. Second, the other party was unwilling to do it. King Tong did not know what had happened in the office of the president, but the reality was right in front of her. Wang Tianzong did not come. The person you are waiting for has reached a new agreement with Wulan State. A voice suddenly sounded, calm, slow, and dignified. He won't come. Your Highness King Tong, your delay is meaningless. It will only make me gather more and more troops. I can give you a choice. You and all the people behind you, immediately put your hands on your heads and squat down. I will send you to where you should go. This time, it was no longer the army of Wulan State that was restless. It was the elites of the Shadow Throne behind King Tong. No one believed what the other party said, but it was hard not to believe it. The Shadow Throne had a good relationship with the Wang family of Beihai. But this kind of friendship was not strong enough for Wang Tianzong to join hands with the Shadow Throne in any case. It was King Tong and Rothschild who had a good relationship with the Wang family of Beihai, not the Shadow Throne. If Wang Tianzong really reached an agreement with Wulan State, it meant that he had given up the Shadow Throne. Regardless of what Wang Tianzong would get from such a move, at least the Shadow Throne would definitely suffer more fatal losses tonight. However, if Wang Tianzong gave up the Shadow Throne, would he also give up King Tong? Several high-level members of the Shadow Throne behind King Tong couldn't help but look at each other. They were born in different wealthy families in Europe, so they were very sensitive to everything. Do you think I will believe it? King Tong sneered and glanced around. The voice came through the loudspeaker and spread over half of the block. King Tong could not determine the location of the other party, but she could be sure that this person was the commander of the operation in Wulan State. You have reasons not to believe it, but this is the truth. His Majesty is now a guest in the office of the President. His Majesty is wise and righteous. Naturally, he will not associate with terrorist organizations. However, His Majesty values friendship. His only request for us is to keep you alive. Your Highness King Tong, please believe in our sincerity. Wang Tianzong had a friendship with the Shadow Throne. But if King Tong was not included, his friendship with the Shadow Throne was really not deep. He abandoned the Shadow Throne and protected King Tong. Wang Tianzong could do it. King Tong's heart suddenly sank. At this moment, she clearly felt that several high-level members behind her were looking at her with naked suspicion. The most important thing was that not only others were suspecting her. Even King Tong's heart began to waver. She did not believe that Wang Tianzong would reach an agreement with Wulan State. However, all the information in the office of the president was not clear. Wang Tianzong had not come so far. King Tong felt that the most likely reason was that Wang Tianzong had encountered a problem and could not get away for the time being. In the case that she could not get away to help, given Wang Tianzong's character, he would not care about the life and death of the other people in the Shadow Throne at all. Was what the other party said true? King Tong's heart was in a mess. Let me introduce myself. The clear and stable voice continued to ring out in the army. I'm Prance, the Minister of the Wulan State Defense Intelligence Department. Your Highness King Tong, His Majesty Sword Emperor is one of the people I respect most. As long as you can surrender tonight, I can guarantee in the name of Wulan State that Wulan State will not hurt you. Prance, the Minister of the Military Intelligence Department of Wulan State. In the entire Wulan State, he was one of the most worthy high-level officials, but he was also recognized as one of the most low-key high-level officials. He had great influence, but he never participated in any struggle for power and profit. When Wulan State was calm, it was the game between Rekvia and the office of the president. Prance remained neutral and did not show any emotion. After the great change in Wulan State, Prance was also neutral and calm. He might not be the most important high-level official in Wulan State, but he could definitely be said to be the master of the entire intelligence system of Wulan state. You don't have to sow discord between me and the Shadow Throne here. General Prance, the Shadow Throne belongs to me, and the Shadow Throne belongs to me. Behind me are all my subordinates. What's the point of your actions? King Tong suddenly sneered. Her attitude was extremely tough, but the suspicious eyes behind her did not weaken at all. Some seeds, once planted, would not disappear even if they did not germinate. You belong to Rothschild. Prance whispered. I suddenly remembered a story. 10 years ago, a secret laboratory of the Rothschild family in France was uprooted, because it was said that there was still nearly 1/3 of the immortality potion in that laboratory. Rothschild has been trying to replicate the miracle of the immortality potion. After the destruction of that laboratory, Rothschild's research in this field has been at a standstill. Because of the destruction of that laboratory, although the enemy did not find the immortality potion in it, they also lost 2 important people who studied related topics. After that, the Patriarch of Rothschild was furious. You also mobilized the entire Shadow Throne to track down the clues. After 3 months of investigation, all the signs finally pointed to the Letson family in France. The Letson family was destroyed, and this matter was finally over. But I don't know if you've noticed it, but less than half a year after the Letson family was destroyed, the Patriarch of the Tanlis family also died of organ failure. Don't you realize something when I say this? There was a faint smile in Prance's voice. Bullshit. Before King Tong could say anything, a middle-aged man behind King Tong suddenly stood up and flew into a rage. His face was flushed and his expression was extremely excited, but there was a trace of panic and fear in the depths of his eyes that couldn't be concealed. His name was Erwin Tanlis. He was now the second in command of the Tanlis family and one of the high-level members of the Shadow Throne. The old patriarch who died of organ failure in Prance's story was his father. Back then, Rothschild's laboratory was uprooted, and Rothschild eventually destroyed the Letson family. The Letson family was not worth mentioning, and it was just a third-rate family in Europe. However, the Tanlis family was a real behemoth and one of the core components of the Shadow Throne. Now that Prance had dug up what happened 10 years ago and pointed the clues to the Tanlis family, if all this was fake, Prance would be really guilty of his evil intentions. The corner of King Tong's eyes suddenly twitched. She glanced at Erwin, and then quickly looked away. She caught the panic and fear in Erwin's eyes. Similarly, after the end of that incident 10 years ago, she also noticed the death of the old patriarch of the Tanlis family. The death of the old patriarch of the Tanlis family was due to organ failure. What this kind of symptom needed the most was the vitality of the immortality potion. Rothschild had been tracking down some clues. But King Tong didn't say it out loud. Because she was the queen of the Shadow Throne. Your Highness, believe me, that incident had nothing to do with the Tanlis family. Erwin suddenly turned around and looked at King Tong with a frightened face. What's there to say about what happened so many years ago? When, of course, I believe you. I saw the innocence of the Tanlis family with my own eyes. You don't have to pay attention to his nonsense. He can even tell what happened 10 years ago. I even suspect that he will fabricate what happened 20 years ago. King Tong took a deep breath and sneered. 20 years ago? Prance laughed. His voice was extremely loud through the loudspeaker. I don't know what happened 20 years ago, but I know what happened 2 years ago. 2 years ago, on June 13th in the summer, Your Highness King Tong, do you remember what you did? King Tong was stunned. She really didn't remember. But in the group behind her, an extremely enchanting and charming woman's face turned pale in an instant. 2 years ago, in the summer, you sent one of your most trusted confidants, who was also the most beautiful woman in the Shadow Throne, Poppy, to seduce the heir of the Tanlis family and poisoned him to death in bed. Tut, it was said that he was the only male in this generation of the Tanlis family. After his death, the inheritance of the Tanlis family fell on Miss Li Mei. It was said that this beautiful daughter of the Tanlis family had already planned to marry the heir of Rothschild. Congratulations. Buzz. King Tong's brain went blank in an instant. Her body tensed up without batting an eyelid, and all the hairs on her body stood on end. Not far behind her, Poppy's face was extremely pale, but she tried her best to keep calm. "Your Highness King Tong, you don't have good taste. You may not know that Poppy, whom you trust very much, is the secret lover of the patriarch of the Johnson family. Even when she entered the Shadow Throne, the Johnson family secretly operated her behind the scenes." There was an indescribable cruelty in Prance's voice. I didn't. With a desperate face, Poppy's face was gray. She walked out, shook her head hard, and looked around at the army around her. Finally, her eyes fell on King Tong. "Your Highness." Poppy's voice was a little trembling. "I have nothing to do with the Johnson family." Everyone saw Poppy, whose face was livid and who looked extremely flustered. Now she seemed to have been completely defeated, and her inner emotions were completely exposed. The elites of the Shadow Throne were thoughtful. They thought, "Did you really seduce young Master Tanlis and finally poison him to death? Otherwise, why are you so flustered?" King Tong was also looking at Poppy. Her eyes were extremely cold and she thought, "Are you really Johnson's pawn? Otherwise, why are you so flustered?" The most important thing was that she had asked Poppy to poison the young master of the Tanlis family. This matter was flawless from beginning to end, and only she and Poppy knew it. King Tong was sure that she hadn't told anyone. Then how did the news leak out? "Your Highness." Another high-level member of the Shadow Throne came over. His voice was heavy and tough. "The other party is obviously talking nonsense and provoking the internal relationship of the Shadow Throne. I suggest that we attack immediately and break out of the encirclement." King Tong looked at the pale-faced Poppy, and then at Erwin, who was staring straight at her. Her eyes finally fell on the high-level member who had just appeared. "May I ask who you are?" Prance seemed to be able to see everything here, and he asked unhurriedly. The middle-aged man sneered and said proudly, "I'm Johnson. Johnson Jodl, the patriarch of the Jodl family." There were also patriarchs of wealthy families in the high-level members of the Shadow Throne. Johnson Jodl was one of them. "Patriarch Jodl?" Prance was silent for a while and suddenly laughed. "No, you're not. I remember another name for you. I should call you High Priest Hall. I can be sure that you are the most talented High Priest in the Holy Punishment Priest group, because I accidentally saw your correspondence with the Pope before. You said that you wanted the light of God to dispel the shadow of Europe and let the light shine on the whole world. Great, you should be a poet." The faces of everyone in the Shadow Throne, including King Tong, changed dramatically. Chapter 493. The Vatican's position in the world was very precise. It was the most influential and successful religion in the world. But the position of the Vatican in the dark world was a little vague. A force, an organization, a country. The vague position made the Vatican in the dark world extremely mysterious. But no one could deny that if the Vatican was defined as a force, it was definitely one of the most terrifying forces in the dark world. Every superpower was extremely powerful. It had confirmed invincible realm experts, solid foundations, mature operating mechanisms, and even murderous weapons. These were all important factors to judge whether a force was a superpower or not. But there were also strong and weak forces among the superpowers. Maybe the gap was not very big, but no matter how small the gap was, it was real. If the superpowers in the dark world were compared in detail, the Vatican might be the only behemoth that could keep pace with the Wang family of Beihai. It was the most powerful force in the dark world. The one slightly inferior to the Vatican and the Wang family of Beihai should be the reclusive Lin clan. But the Lin clan had always been reclusive, so it could be ignored. After the Lin clan, it was the Shadow Throne of Rothschild, the Jiang family of South America, and the Polar Ground Alliance before it collapsed. After that, it was the Dark Knights, Fantasy World, and the Heroes Club. The last one was the Purgatory of Heaven Capital, which had risen rapidly in the past 3 years and was powerful, but its foundation was unstable and its operating mechanism was not mature enough. Below the Purgatory of Heaven Capital were the first-line forces in the Dark World. Among them, the craziest and most brilliant one in recent years was the Samsara Palace. The master of Samsara Palace was extremely powerful, the 12 supermasters were loyal, and the murderous weapon Blue Sky Underworld fell into the Samsara. The Samsara Palace had become more and more perfect. But their most fatal flaw was the lack of a foundation for their development. So now the Samsara Palace was like a castle in the air that looked extremely gorgeous but could collapse at any time. It could not be counted as a superpower. Similar to the Samsara Palace, there were many first-line forces in the Dark World that were extremely powerful but also had flaws. For example, the 4 families in Eastern Europe could be counted as a member of this list. Sai City in Zhongzhou State was also a first-line force. There were more second-line forces below the first-line forces. Zhongzhou State, Jade Pool, Mount Shu, Azura Path. East Island, Wuji Palace, Jifeng Sword Raining School, Liuhua Palace. Assassin groups and mercenary groups that could ignore national boundaries. Even the European Shadow Throne and the former Polar Ground Alliance were superpowers formed by many first-rate and second-rate forces. In addition to these major forces with transcendent positions in their respective fields, the power center of the special warfare system of each country was another system. Kunlun City, the Men in Black. Every country had its own special warfare center. This was the current situation of the Dark World. In the Dark World, there were 3 forces that could be called superpowers and could also be regarded as special warfare centers. The Shadow Throne was the special warfare center of the EU for complicated and special reasons. The Purgatory of Heaven capital was the special warfare center of East Island. This was also the result of East Island's compromise in the face of strong pressure. The last one was the Vatican. What do you think the Vatican is? The Vatican could be anything. If you said that the Vatican was a superforce, then it was a superforce. If you say the Vatican is a religion, then it is a religion. If you say that the Vatican is a country, then it is a country. You said that the Vatican is the special warfare center, they themselves were the country, and they were also the center of the special warfare. It was the only force in the Dark World with a history of more than 2,000 years. A long history meant the most stable and mature mechanism, magnificent and unparalleled. In the history of nearly 500 years, there were only 2 forces that had always stood at the top of the Dark World. One was the Wang family of Beihai, and the other was the Vatican. Even though Rothschild had 2 popes. But the Vatican was still the Vatican. This was the most terrible thing about it. It was unshakable and irreplaceable. Rothschild did not replace the Vatican. But their family had a pope, so they could be said to know the forces of the Vatican best. The Vatican had always been extremely mysterious. Even other superpowers had limited knowledge. Some duties were put on the surface. The bishops were the spokesmen of the Vatican, aboveboard and positive. The Holy Disarmament Corps was the strongest armed force of the Vatican, responsible for eliminating heresy. The Holy Punishment Priest Group was responsible for brainwashing. The duties were clear, but also vague. But Rothschild clearly knew the specific duties of the major agencies of the Vatican. The duty of the Holy Punishment Priest Group was not so much brainwashing as control. Control and judgment. The most comprehensive control could be done in many ways, and all of them were the duties of the Holy Punishment Priest Group. The most important thing was that although Rothschild had left the position of Pope for hundreds of years, they also had pawns that could play an important role in the major departments of the Vatican. Prance said that Patriarch Johnson Jodl of the Jodl family was Priest Hall of the Holy Punishment Priest Group. The Jodl family was one of the traditional wealthy families of the empire where the sun never set and had a very close relationship with the royal family of the empire where the sun never set. In the whole of Europe, the Jodl family could not be regarded as a first-rate force, but it was much stronger than the second-rate forces. It could be said to be one of the core components of the Shadow Throne. Johnson Jodl was the patriarch of the Jodl family. If his true identity was Priest Hall of the Vatican, King Tong felt that she should not believe Prance's nonsense. How could a person in charge of the military intelligence, who might not even be a third-rate country in Europe, casually reveal the most important secret of the Vatican? But King Tong had really heard of the name Priest Hall. He He was one of the 9 red-robed priests of the Holy Punishment Priest group and one of the most important assistants of the Holy Virgin in controlling the Holy Punishment Priest group. His code name was Illusion, and he was good at disguise, lurking, and hypnosis. In the entire Vatican, he was a very important red-robed priest, and his status was even no less than that of the well-known red-robed archbishops in the Vatican. King Tong glanced at Johnson Jodl with a vague look in her eyes. Johnson Jodl's expression was neither flustered nor incredulous. When he heard General Prance's words, he only showed anger. Enough. General Prance, you must be responsible for everything you said. In the future, the entire Wulan state will pay the price for your stupid behavior today. His eyes were tough and blazing. A very heavy price. Prance laughed and said something inexplicable. High Priest Hall, someone told me that many years ago, we had a drink by the Lingson Lake. Johnson sneered and said nothing. He only felt that it was a little ridiculous. He had never been to the famous Lingson Lake in Eastern Europe. But now it seems that I don't have a chance. I will miss that pot of wine. Prance said softly, Your Highness King Tong, you can doubt my words, but you have a chance to prove it. The real Patriarch Johnson was secretly assassinated by the Vatican half a year ago and replaced by High Priest Hall. He shouldn't have time to do the most thorough plastic surgery. If you can lift the mask on his face, I believe you can get enough surprises. Johnson quickly closed his eyes, concealing all his emotions for a moment. Then he turned around, looked at King Tong, and asked seriously, Your Highness, do you believe me? King Tong was silent for a moment. Johnson was just an expert a half step to the invincible realm. It was not difficult for King Tong to verify his identity. But now, King Tong looked at Johnson. There was calmness in Johnson's eyes. Yvain, another high-level member of the Shadow Throne, was quietly looking at the pale-faced Poppy. Poppy was looking at King Tong with undisguised pleading in his eyes. There were countless uneven breathing sounds behind her. At this moment, King Tong suddenly realized that the moment Prance opened his mouth, the whole situation was no longer under her control. After Wulan State attacked the Shadow Throne, the killing intent gathered by the Shadow Throne quietly dropped to the lowest point. At this time, everyone was looking at their companions with fear, and suspicion. Everyone had a ghost in their heart. When this ghost was ready to make a move, everyone looked like a ghost in the eyes of others. King Tong suddenly felt a little powerless. In her sight, Johnson's face was sincere and fake. But at this moment, King Tong really didn't have the courage to do anything. Remove the mask? Or without the mask? The second result was undoubtedly the best. But if the first result really happened, the Shadow Throne was doomed to be wiped out tonight. Most importantly, she had really heard of the name of Priest Hall. Prance provoked the Shadow Throne. King Tong gritted her teeth and said word by word, Kill him. She really didn't dare to take off the mask on Johnson's face. She just wanted to end everything tonight. But what she didn't know was that with her character, she didn't expose Prance's lie on the spot, which was an extremely abnormal thing in the eyes of others. Therefore, the morale of the elites of the Shadow Throne didn't gather. Instead, it declined again. A close-up of King Tong's facial expression was playing on the huge screen. On countless small screens, there were close-ups of the expressions of every middle and high-level member of the Shadow Throne. Each of their subtle expressions was clearly displayed on the screen. In the last military truck of Wulan State's army, Prance watched all this silently through the screen. From the faces of these people, he saw panic, fear, confusion, suspicion, and fear. At the same time, he saw hatred and viciousness. Prance chuckled. He liked this kind of emotion. This was exactly what he wanted most tonight. Their hearts are in a mess. Prance said slowly, General Jack, you can let your army attack. Prance was not the commander of tonight's operation. General Jack, the trusted general of Prime Minister Rieker, was the commander. However, with the arrival of Prance naturally got the command here. Well. General Jack casually agreed a few times, but his eyes didn't move away from Prance. His eyes were filled with disbelief, as if it wasn't until tonight that he truly saw the true face of Prance, the Military Intelligence Department's minister. Minister, Jack hesitated for a moment and couldn't help but ask tentatively, "How did you do it?" What? Prance was slightly stunned. His appearance was extremely ordinary, but he looked gentle, elegant, and extremely modest. Jack pointed to the extremely complicated faces of the shadow throne on the screen. Prance smiled and said softly, "It's very simple. Let them doubt and fear each other. Naturally, we can weaken their combat effectiveness and reduce our losses. For example, Poppy is one of King Tong's most trusted subordinates. But trust is sometimes cheap. I know something that only the two of them know, and I casually told them. So there was a rift between them." The corner of Jack's mouth twitched, and he had nothing to say. The reason was very simple. But the problem was, how could Prance know the secret that only King Tong and Poppy knew? "Don't forget my job. I'm in the intelligence business," Prance said with a smile. "Minister, has your intelligence gone deep into the deepest secrets of the Vatican?" Jack thought of High Priest Hall and asked, crying and laughing. "It's a coincidence." Prance calmed down for a while and then said blandly, "My master saw the heretic list of the Vatican some time ago. It was made half a year ago. The Jodl family is one of the families in Europe that are most opposed to the Vatican, but the name of Patriarch Johnson is not on the heretic list. Doesn't that explain something?" Jack was stunned. He didn't expect that someone outside the Vatican could look through the heretic list kept by the Pope. Nor did he expect that Prance would have a master. "Minister," Jack was a little hesitant. "General Jack, now we can get to know each other again." Prance reached out his hand with a smile and said softly, "I'm Prance, the Minister of the Military Intelligence Department of Wulan State. I belong to the Samsara Palace, and I'm also the Chief Intelligence Officer of the Samsara Palace in Eastern Europe." Jack swallowed hard and finally understood everything. All the information just now naturally came from the Samsara Palace. He remembered Prance's explanation just now. He looked through the heretic list of the Vatican. This reason could explain a lot of problems. But the reason was not sufficient. But these were not important to him at all. Jack looked at Prance and said tentatively, "Attack?" The news that the family of Carlos, the former president of Wulan State, had died strangely had begun to spread in Wulan State. Everyone understood the cruelty of this. Now that Jack had been forced to participate, he knew very well what all this meant tonight. This was equivalent to another date of death. Victory or defeat. It was about life and death. On the date of death, Li Tianlan won, so President Carlos died. If the Shadow Throne won today, tomorrow not only him, but also Riker and even Li Tianlan, everyone would end up as miserable as Carlos. This was the battle in the Dark World. Between victory and defeat, blood, lies, and sins flowed. Jack looked at the faces of the elites of the Shadow Throne on the screen. His hesitation slowly subsided, and he even gained a little more confidence. "What do you think?" Prance looked at Jack with a smile. His smile was light and breezy. Jack nodded. Without hesitation, he directly picked up the walkie-talkie and roared, "Wulan State. Attack. Kill them all." Prance quietly looked at the army of Wulan State that suddenly began to charge. In the overwhelming gunshots, he smiled softly. There was a devil in everyone's heart. This was especially true for a force like the Shadow Throne. Tonight, Wulan State was bound to win. But it would not be Wulan State that would devour the Shadow Throne in the future. It was the shadow and devil hidden in the hearts of everyone in the Shadow Throne. Chapter 494. Wulan State was not a first-class country in Europe. Even in Eastern Europe, Wulan State was not the most powerful country. However, this country, which was famous for its many beauties, abundant resources, and sensitive geographical location, had the strictest and even cruelest military law in the world. This country had the darkest military court in the world. Anyone who violated the battlefield discipline would rather die than go to the military court. Death was not terrible. The most terrible thing was to live a life worse than death. Every soldier in Wulan State knew this sentence. Military orders were irrevocable. In the face of military orders, the army of Wulan State could be defeated, but no one dared to disobey them, even if the military orders were to send them to their deaths. General Jack's irascible roar spread throughout the whole block at once. Manic, vicious, and hysterical. Kill them all. Such a military order was extremely simple, but it was also extremely firm. There would be no more negotiations, no more confrontations. King Tong also had no capital to stall for time. The lingering sound of General Jack's roar set off a war that swept through the entire Reki city, which was even more terrible than the date of death. The soldiers of Wulan's state surged like a tide. After a short silence, a large number of gunshots broke out completely. The army began to move forward. Densely packed soldiers occupied all the space in the field of vision, completely crowded in all directions, and rushed over without leaving a single gap. The smoke and dust rising from the ruins of the Caesar Hotel had been washed away by the rain. Looking down from the sky, the army of Wulan State, which occupied almost the entire block, was rushing in the direction of the Caesar Hotel desperately. King Tong led the Shadow Throne to stand in the center of the ruins. They were surrounded by troops in all directions. The sea of people rushed forward. The open space around King Tong was getting smaller and smaller, and it was about to be completely submerged by the troops rushing over from all directions. King Tong's eyes were cold, but deep in her eyes, there was confusion. She finally realized her mistake. Her biggest mistake was that she should not have stalled for time when she was surrounded. In other words, she should not have trusted Wang Tianzong too much. Wang Tianzong had no reason to give up the Shadow Throne. In such a situation, if he could appear, he would not have waited until now. But he did not appear, which was enough to show that he had encountered a problem that he could not get out of for the time being. At that time, she should have taken action and directly chosen the toughest way to break out of the encirclement. But she waited for a while. This short period of time was not long, but it gave Prance the best opportunity. Before the collapse of the Polar Ground Alliance, it used to be the largest organization in the Dark World, but it was not the most powerful. Huge and powerful, there was only a difference of one word, but there was a huge difference between the two. The reason why the Polar Ground Alliance was so large was that it had become bloated after accommodating the will of the 4 great families and more than 20 countries in Eastern Europe. It seemed to be full of talents, but in fact, it was extremely chaotic. Countries wrangled with each other, and the big families fought openly and secretly, which limited the development of the Polar Ground Alliance. The Shadow Throne had also experienced such a period, but today, the Shadow Throne was far more mature than the Polar Ground Alliance. But no matter how mature the Shadow Throne was, it couldn't change a fact. This fact was laid bare in front of everyone, making it impossible for them to ignore it. That was, like the Polar Ground Alliance, the Shadow Throne was also a behemoth composed of many forces and countries. They were more mature and streamlined than the Polar Ground Alliance. But in essence, they were not much different from the Polar Ground Alliance. The Polar Ground Alliance collapsed, and Eastern Europe was in chaos. From the very beginning, the chaos in Eastern Europe was the internal strife of the 4 great families. In the end, it involved all the countries in Eastern Europe, various fields, and even beliefs. In the end, it became the muddy water of today. In addition to the fact that other superpowers in the Dark World were too strong, the biggest reason for all this was that the Polar Ground Alliance was very complicated inside. The interior of the Shadow Throne was also very complicated. The dozens of powerful families inside the Shadow Throne carried the will of the vast majority of countries in the European Union. Different interests, cooperation, disputes, and conflicts happened almost every day. What King Tong, the Queen, did the most was to balance the interests inside the Shadow Throne. She had done a good job over the years, so she was very prestigious in all of Europe. But no matter how well she did, those disputes still existed. When they were in the Shadow Throne, they had the same position. But in their respective families, everyone had different positions. Everyone had done a lot of shady things in the open and in the dark. So, everyone had a guilty conscience. King Tong had a guilty conscience. Because she did ask Poppy to poison the young master of the Tanlis family. Others also had a guilty conscience. Thus, Prance used the simplest but most brilliant method in the short period of time that she was stalling for time. It was a trick to sow discord. The only difference was that not all of what Prance said was fiction. Almost all of what he said was true. These facts quietly provoked the different positions in the Shadow Throne. They were like a blunt knife stained with poison. It was not sharp, but it could kill as soon as it saw blood. In just a few words, the anger and killing intent that had been condensed in the Shadow Throne turned into suspicion and fear. King Tong had never encountered such a situation. In the face of the army rushing over from Wulan State and the overwhelming hail of bullets, she tried her best to open her domain. Submachine guns, assault rifles, sniper rifles, and even machine guns. The completely violent bullets completely replaced the rain and hit King Tong's domain like crazy. It was difficult for ordinary firearms to pose a threat to an invincible realm expert. That was because there were not enough of them. When thousands of bullets were crashing into the domain of the invincible realm every minute and second, the huge impact suddenly made King Tong's domain tremble. King Tong's face seemed to turn pale, and she looked a little delicate. The domain of the invincible realm enveloped all the elites of the Shadow Throne. But strange emotions were still spreading in the group of the Shadow Throne, and they became more and more subtle. King Tong's heart had sunk to the bottom. She suddenly took a deep breath and said in a deep voice, "Everyone." Her voice was low and dignified. The hearts of everyone in the Shadow Throne trembled violently. "Everything that happened today is my responsibility, and I'm willing to bear all the consequences. If we can survive tonight, I will submit a review report to the European Union. Now everything is happening in front of us. Maybe there are many problems inside the Shadow Throne, but now, I don't think it's the time to consider these problems. Now we are facing life and death, not grievances. As the Queen, I ask you to cooperate with me. When we kill our way out, I will give you an explanation for everything in the Shadow Throne." The dense gunshots became more and more violent. In the sight of the Shadow Throne, the twisted and desperate faces of the troops of Wulan State rushing over from all directions could already be seen. Countless muzzles were spewing flames, and thousands of bullets flew over, almost turning into a wall that filled the whole world. The wall formed by the bullets smashed hard into the domain of King Tong. The domain of the invincible realm itself was the void. But at this moment, the domain in the void gradually took shape under the huge impact. With King Tong as the center, the domain of the invincible realm seemed to be like a transparent and glowing light shield. The light shield was trembling violently, as if it would break at any time. "Everyone, break out of the encirclement." King Tong's voice became cold and indifferent in an instant. The overwhelming bullets covered up the heavy rain, the night, and the whole city. The cold metal color of the bullets was everywhere, which was the smell and color of death. King Tong opened her arms and suddenly said, "Defense." In an instant, the domain of the invincible realm around her disappeared for a moment. The endless light suddenly swallowed the approaching army of Wulan State. Everyone in the Shadow Throne attacked with all their might. Thunder, raging fire, and cold ice suddenly bloomed with blood. Tens of thousands of bullets were evaporated, and most of them exploded and dissipated in the air. But a small number of bullets passed through the thunder and raging fire and rushed into the crowd of the army of Wulan State on the opposite side like a rainstorm. The moment the two sides touched each other, a large number of people died. The bloody and tragic scene directly made the war in the whole block completely white-hot. The domain of King Tong sometimes opened and sometimes closed. Every time the domain bloomed and shrank, it would be accompanied by endless thunder and raging fire, devouring a large number of lives of Wulan State. The Shadow Throne, with low morale, barely formed a hole and rushed to kill in the endless crowd almost crazily. Forward. They killed all the way out. King Tong, who had the strongest attack power, had completely given up attacking. She tried her best to maintain her domain and shrouded all the people in the Shadow Throne. As for the attack and killing, it was all handed over to the elites and high-level officials of the Shadow Throne. Dozens of thunder-shocking realm experts, hundreds of fire-flaming realm experts, and hundreds of ice-condensing realm experts broke out at the same time. They were surrounded by crowds. But the entire Shadow Throne was like an incomparably huge meat grinder, moving forward rapidly in the rain of blood. In the truck that served as the temporary headquarters at the rear, General Jack, who saw this scene with his own eyes, could not help but twitch his face, which was full of muscles, and kept trembling. He knew that the Shadow Throne was terrifying, but only when he saw it with his own eyes did he know how terrifying the Shadow Throne was. There were enemies in all directions, and they were almost crowded. There were less than 1,000 elites of the Shadow Throne left in the crowd, and they almost didn't stop at all. They moved forward, killed, and kept moving forward. Flesh and blood flew everywhere. The corners of King Tong's mouth were also twitching. Their killing speed was already extremely fast. But the sea of people in front of them seemed to be endless, and they couldn't see the end at all. The surrounding soldiers of Wulan State were already full of fear, but they were pushed forward by the crowd behind them. In despair, the soldiers burst out with ferocity. They rushed over with red eyes, and then they were crushed. After one group after another, the soldiers in front of King Tong were still full of fear and finally rushed over with red eyes. There was no word to describe the cruelty at this time. The military of Wulan State. The Shadow Throne. Tonight, it could be said that it was a real battle of life and death. Prance still stayed in the truck and looked at the battlefield on the screen with the camera. King Tong, Irwin, Johnson, and Poppy. Several sensitive figures flashed in front of him one by one. Prance narrowed his eyes and looked a little nervous. A white light suddenly lit up in King Tong's domain. The light almost brushed past the limit of Prance's sight. Soon it flashed away. It was like a palm with light. The corners of Prance's eyes twitched slightly. In a very short period of time, no one could see what had happened at all. But King Tong's body suddenly froze. She didn't notice the hand in the crowd behind her, but she vaguely noticed the white light. After the white light, she saw Johnson, who had been very close to her. Johnson's face. Johnson's real face. A small part of Johnson's face was torn off by that hand. What appeared in King Tong's sight was an extremely feminine, handsome, but extremely cold face. High Priest Hall. King Tong's heart suddenly became extremely cold. High Priest Hall also seemed to realize something. He looked at King Tong with deep eyes. King Tong's eyes instantly became extremely fierce. Before High Priest Hall's mask was taken off, she could pretend that nothing had happened. But now, half of the other party's face was exposed, which was equivalent to completely blocking the reason for her not to make a move. King Tong didn't even have time to think about who had taken advantage of the chaos to take off half of High Priest Hall's mask. The moment she saw this face, in order to stabilize the inside of the Shadow Throne, she had already directly made a move and punched High Priest Hall without hesitation. Go all out. Almost at the same time, an ear-piercing voice came from inside the Shadow Throne. Queen King Tong killed someone. King Tong killed someone. Chapter 495 is a chapter of 9,000 words big. It wasn't until King Tong's power had surged in front of High Priest Hall that she was not sure what had happened. The white light just now flashed away. It was precise, swift, straightforward, and the result was equally clear. The face belonging to Patriarch Johnson was torn to pieces in an instant. The current patriarch of the Jodl family only had half of a mask covering his face, while the other half of his face was a strange face that no one had ever seen before. This was enough to explain a lot. At the very least, it showed that the patriarch of the Jodl family in front of her was not the real Johnson Jodl. All of King Tong's actions were based on instinct. The contradictions within the Shadow Throne were obscure and intense, and everyone had a guilty conscience. But before everything was really exposed, King Tong could only choose to unite all the forces to break out of the encirclement. At such a sensitive time, even if Patriarch Johnson was really High Priest Hall, as long as he was not exposed, King Tong was willing to endure it. But now, most of Johnson's mask had been torn off. His true face was exposed in front of everyone. As the Queen of the Shadow Throne, King Tong had no choice. Even if she knew that it was stupid, she had to take action. Even if the person who pretended to be Johnson was not High Priest Hall, as long as he was not Johnson, King Tong had to kill him in this case. A huge force suddenly exploded in the narrow space. The small space nearby seemed to be completely frozen by King Tong's punch. Patriarch Johnson, who had half of his face handsome and cold, and the other half rough and calm, crossed his arms in front of his chest. The strong blue light completely wrapped his upper body, which looked extremely dazzling. The punch that condensed the surrounding air smashed hard on the blue arms. The frozen air exploded, and a strong wind was suddenly set off in the rain of bullets. The strong wind was all-pervasive and blew out blood. King Tong directly punched Patriarch Johnson and sent him flying. Blood fell in a mess, and the huge force kept shaking the illusion. The people in the shadow throne nearby were all swaying and bleeding. Patriarch Johnson moved and looked at King Tong. His eyes were cold and mocking. King Tong killed someone? King Tong killed someone? A hysterical voice suddenly sounded and spread throughout the shadow throne's phalanx. The moment everyone's eyes shifted over, Patriarch Johnson's furious roar suddenly rang out. King Tong! What do you want? King Tong was stunned for a moment and looked over with rapt attention. Johnson was standing on the edge of the battlefield, covered in blood. Countless thunderbolts gathered into a wall in front of him, blocking the bullets coming from all directions. Blood flowed down his body. In the dazzling purple light, Johnson's face was extremely clear. That was Johnson's face. It never changed. King Tong was in a trance, and then she suddenly came to her senses. For a moment, everyone in the shadow throne looked at her strangely. Hypnosis! King Tong stared at Johnson. At this moment, she could finally confirm his identity. Prance wasn't lying. He was indeed a divine punishment priest. The white light had been fake, and no one had taken off Johnson's mask. Everything she had seen and felt had been an illusion. The other party's face was still intact. King Tong didn't know why she was so easily hypnotized. But at this moment, she suddenly realized that the Shadow Throne had fallen into an unprecedented crisis. This crisis did not come from the surrounding army of Wulan State. Instead, the shadow that had been hidden inside the Shadow Throne suddenly began to break out, devouring everyone's trust and tacit understanding. King Tong's brain was buzzing. A faint voice sounded in her ears and turned into an extremely noisy discussion. Julian is dead. My God, what does the Queen want to do? She believed Prance's words. Do you believe it? Whether you believe it or not, at least I won't make a sneak attack. A mouthful of blood gushed up her throat, and it tasted extremely sweet. Julian was one of the youngest high-level members of the Shadow Throne. He came from the famous William family in France. The William family was an important behemoth in the entire Shadow Throne, and its comprehensive strength was not much worse than that of Rothschild. Julian, who was only 35 years old this year, had entered the high level of the Shadow Throne. This alone showed the strong influence of the William family in Europe. The William family had a good relationship with the Jodl family. When King Tong punched just now, Julian happened to be beside Johnson. Johnson dodged the punch. However, Julian's soul was torn apart by King Tong's violent punch. Your Highness King Tong, we have never offended you in the slightest, nor have we been framed. Your action just now has brought huge losses to the entire William family. Do you think you can kill your subordinates at will because the Queen is from Rothschild? A cold voice sounded in the crowd. A high-level member of the William family, who used to be very respectful to King Tong, stood up and said with a cold face, I need an explanation for this matter. T explanation. Patriarch Johnson suddenly sneered. The Jodl family will no longer work for a woman who doesn't trust Jodl. This is a battlefield, but as one of us, she sneaked up on me. Go to hell. I announce that the Jodl family officially withdraws from the Shadow Throne. King Tong? T. It's all T. His voice spread far away in the night. In the last truck, Prance, who was quietly watching the scene in front of him, was slightly stunned. Then he said calmly, General Jack, order the 9th Infantry Battalion to retreat and support the third point of the battlefield. The 9th Infantry Battalion was a heavy-armored elite infantry reinforced battalion, with a total number of nearly 500 people. Such elite troops were the strongest troops on the battlefield, especially on the urban battlefield. Under normal circumstances, they should not act rashly. However, Jack hesitated for a moment, picked up the walkie-talkie, and quickly gave the order. The 9th Infantry Battalion began to move the battlefield as soon as it received the order. Johnson suddenly found that the army of Wulan State, which was closest to him, relaxed for a moment with the mobilization of the 9th Infantry Battalion. There seemed to be a chance to break out of the encirclement. Johnson seized the opportunity without hesitation and said loudly, "King Tong doesn't deserve to be the queen of the Shadow Throne at all. The Jodl family will no longer listen to the orders of a woman. Warriors of the Jodl family, I am your patriarch. Now I order you to break out of the encirclement with me to the west." In the war, the Jodl family became the first family to withdraw from the Shadow Throne. Huge waves emerged in the hearts of everyone in the Shadow Throne. In the crowd, at least 100 elites began to gather decisively in the direction of the Jodl family after a little hesitation. The Shadow Throne was a collection of all the major families in Europe. The power of the major families was the power of the Shadow Throne. When a family withdrew from the Shadow Throne, it would naturally take away its own power. The more families left the Shadow Throne, the weaker the power of the Shadow Throne would be. Johnson wanted to take away the elites of the Jodl family, which was not a poaching. But in this situation, such a move could really be said to shake the foundation of the Shadow Throne fundamentally. At this time, King Tong really had no way out. She saw a conspiracy, a complacency, and a mockery in Johnson's eyes. What she had done the moment she was hypnotized just now could not be made up for at all. It was impossible for King Tong to watch Johnson, or rather, High Priest Hall, divide the power of the Shadow Throne, so she could only take action. Dozens of elites of the Jodl family gathered around Johnson. Without hesitation, Johnson turned around and broke out of the encirclement. In the army of Wulan State, one after another, urgent and clear military orders were passed down. In the direction of the Jodl family's breakout, the army of Wulan State made way for them after symbolic resistance, directly opening a way for the Jodl family in the chaos. There was a chance of survival ahead. And behind them was a cliff. King Tong chased after them from behind in silence. She did not explain, curse, or ask them to stay. When all these things were meaningless, the only thing she could do was to take action. Iskandin's tomb. A pure and dazzling halo suddenly lit up beside King Tong. The light spread wildly in all directions. The thunder spread, the raging fire surged, and the ice burst. The wind that could destroy everything was as cold as a knife, whistling toward the team of the Jodl family with killing intent all over the sky. Johnson suddenly turned his head. In his sight, King Tong's figure rose into the air, still looking arrogant and dignified. But Johnson saw loneliness, confusion, panic, and helplessness in this arrogance. Arrogance was a sin. An original sin. Johnson laughed. He stretched out his hand and pointed at King Tong. His voice was cold, and he said without hesitation, "Kill her." An extremely bright dark blue lightning condensed and bloomed at his fingertips. With a slight crackling sound, the dark blue lightning flew in an instant. All the elites of the Jodl family took action almost at the same time. Their subconscious reaction was to fight back with all their might. The blazing fire and the extremely dry lightning suddenly combined. The dazzling light surged in the earth-shattering gunshots. King Tong's figure was still in the air. Her powerful domain devoured all the incoming attacks, but her figure could not help but pause. In just a few seconds, the people of the Jodl family had integrated into the army of Wulan State and were getting farther and farther away. King Tong took a deep breath, and her golden pupils suddenly turned into an extremely strange scarlet. She had been the queen of the Shadow Throne for nearly 20 years. For the past 20 years, the Shadow Throne had been very stable under her control. Although it had never become stronger, it had never weakened in the slightest. Before tonight, the Shadow Throne was still one of the strongest superpowers in the Dark World. But with a sudden siege, the Black Dragon army with a few words from Prance, the entire Shadow Throne had begun to show large cracks, and even its foundation was on the verge of collapse. The Jodl family, which had a strong foundation in the empire where the sun never sets, openly left the Shadow Throne at a time when the Shadow Throne was in danger. If King Tong couldn't keep the Jodl family, the future of the entire Shadow Throne would become extremely dangerous. She had to kill Johnson and let the other people in the Shadow Throne see their fate. Only in this way could she temporarily deter the others and let them unite against the outside world. King Tong took a deep breath. The taste of blood in her throat was slowly spat out by her. Her body straightened for a moment, and then she suddenly rushed into the crowd like an arrow leaving the bow. The domain of the invincible realm condensed around her and began to spin wildly. King Tong's charming and enchanting body crashed into the crowd. It was like a sharp knife cutting through soft tofu. With the charge of King Tong, the entire army of Wulan State suddenly shot out a large amount of blood. An invincible realm expert charged alone in the army. No one or team could stop King Tong's advance. Broken weapons, messy gunshots, flying blood, and broken corpses flew into the sky and fell down one by one. King Tong's speed was getting faster and faster. As the domain spun wildly, King Tong burst out with all her strength. In just a few seconds, she had already forcibly rushed out a passage of nearly 100 meters in the army of Wulan State. The passage was full of broken weapons and corpses. The next second, the army of Wulan State filled the empty space again and trampled all the soldiers into a pile of blood. There was no battlefield in King Tong's eyes. All she could see were the people of the Jodl family. Johnson kept looking back. Looking at King Tong, who was getting closer and closer, he rushed forward crazily. With one military order after another, the army of Wulan State completely made way for the Jodl family, and a large number of troops blocked King Tong. King Tong, who was completely desperate to break out, burned her physical strength, and approached Johnson at a speed visible to the naked eye. Halt! King Tong, who had begun to bleed from the corner of her mouth, suddenly screamed. With a shrill voice, her figure jumped into the sky, and all the domain instantly condensed on her extremely white palm. Johnson subconsciously turned his head, and his pupils suddenly contracted. There was a dark spot in King Tong's palm, which could absorb almost all the light. The darkness fluctuated violently in her hand, with a power that he could not resist at all. King Tong closed her palm. The darkness spread in her hand, and her entire arm became blurred. Go to hell! King Tong's voice suddenly became very calm. She raised her palm. The extreme darkness instantly spread into a shadow. The shadow obscured all the light and vitality, like a black tide, drowning everything. The unique skill, Shadow Kingdom. It was one of King Tong's most powerful unique skills. No one in the Shadow Throne could resist this unique skill. Johnson could not. His real identity, Hull, could not either. But he was the High Priest of the Vatican. An identity that did not belong to the Shadow Throne could naturally attract reinforcements that did not belong to the Shadow Throne. Suddenly, a ball of raging fire ignited in the black tide. The raging fire rose to the sky in an instant with an incredible high temperature. The rain within a radius of nearly 100 meters was completely evaporated. The cold air rapidly heated up, from cold to warm, from warm to hot, from hot to scorching. The fire gradually spread to the entire Shadow Kingdom. It was like a sun suddenly rising in the darkness. King Tong, who had turned around and was about to fight back, suddenly froze and screamed. Boom! The shadow and the raging fire broke out completely. The aftermath of the power involved the nearby army of Wulan State and the elites of Jodl, but most of the power rushed to King Tong. King Tong's body instinctively retreated, and in the blink of an eye, she had already retreated dozens of meters away. A blurry figure in black appeared in front of High Priest Hall. He narrowed his eyes, glanced at King Tong, slowly turned around and said calmly, "Follow me." Hall nodded. The elites of the entire Jodl family followed the black figure and crossed the army of Wulan State, getting farther and farther away. King Tong gritted her teeth. After a few seconds of silence, she slowly turned around. She was not sure who had suddenly stopped her from killing Johnson, but she was sure that it was someone from the Vatican. Among the experts of the Vatican who had come to Eastern Europe this time, the person just now could not be Arcis, and chaos had already fallen. The only candidate was Mellad, the second commander of the Holy Disarmament Corps of the Vatican. With the combat capability of the Invincible Realm, after being personally crowned by the Pope, although he was still no match for King Tong, it was also impossible for King Tong to destroy the Jodl family under his protection. King Tong took a deep look in the direction in which the Jodl family had left, turned around again, and rushed to the shadow throne behind her. "Thank you." With King Tong's departure, the Jodl family's retreat became slower and slower, and they became calmer and calmer. The army of Wulan State seemed to completely ignore them. They kept rushing past them and besieging the shadow throne, completely ignoring them. High Priest Hall, who was completely relieved, looked at the black figure that suddenly appeared and said softly, "Your Highness Meld, have you been nearby all this time?" "It's not just me." Mellad chuckled. "At this time, many forces have already arrived nearby and are silently observing all this. It's just that no one has taken action for the time being. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't have taken action." High Priest Hall was silent for a while, nodded, and said again, "Thank you." Mellad shook his head with a smile, looked at High Priest Hall, and said softly, "You did a good job." There were many meanings to this, "very good." The Jodl family had openly left the Shadow Throne, which was equivalent to stabbing the Shadow Throne hard. And it was also impossible for the elites of the Jodl family that he had brought out to return to the Shadow Throne. They could only choose to enter the Vatican. The Jodl family was not a first-tier force in Europe, but they were also a very important part of the Shadow Throne. If the Jodl family officially joined the Vatican would undoubtedly have another extremely important bargaining chip in the battle between the Vatican and the Shadow Throne. "Let the light of God dispel the shadows and shine on the whole world," Mellad murmured in a low voice. Mellad murmured in a low voice. He looked at High Priest Hall and said sincerely, "Priest, you are really a poet." High Priest Hall did not reply. He just looked back in the direction of the Shadow Throne. His eyes were calm and cruel. After a long time, he said slowly, "The Shadow Throne is finished." Mellad nodded. Whether he was a follower or the second commander of the Holy Disarmament Corps of the Vatican, everything tonight was enough to make him sigh with emotion. The chaos in Eastern Europe involved the whole Dark World. After the Jiang family of South America was dismally eliminated, the Shadow Throne was destined to become the second superpower to lose everything. Even losing everything would be the best outcome. Everything tonight had been predestined. The fate of the Shadow Throne was even more miserable than that of the Jiang family of South America. The Jiang family of South America expelled Jiang Qiansong, but they still had a new patriarch with a bright future, Jiang Guochu. What about the Shadow Throne? The alliance of the major forces had begun to loosen. Even if King Tong led people out of the encirclement tonight, so what? The army of Wulan State could not stop them. But the Vatican, the Heroes Club, Fantasy World, the Men in Black, the Dark Knights, and even Li Tianlan would stop them. So the Shadow Throne was finished. They would not have a second ending. They could only be destroyed. The whole army would be destroyed. Mellad suddenly thought of the Samsara Palace. The chaos in Eastern Europe today could be said to be caused by the Samsara Palace. To be precise, it was caused by Qin Weibai. Everyone said that after the chaos in Eastern Europe, the Samsara Palace would inevitably be completely destroyed. But it had developed to the present. The Samsara Palace had not moved yet. The Jiang family of South America, which had suffered heavy losses, could not recover in a short time. The Shadow Throne would also be destroyed and disappear from the stage of the Dark World. Everything seemed very abrupt and sudden, but it was all inevitable. In such a chaotic situation, the Jiang family of South America would not be the first to be eliminated. The Shadow Throne would not be the first to be destroyed either. And as there were fewer and fewer competitors, the crazy interests in Eastern Europe would become more and more attractive, and the fighting would become more and more tragic. What would it be like after the chaos was over? What was even more incredible was that all of this today was driven by Li Tianlan, but all the preconditions were planned by Qin Weibai. Mellad suddenly felt a little awestruck. He thought of His Highness, and his whole body trembled involuntarily. Qin Weibai and His Highness were essentially the same people, weren't they? They had such a huge advantage in some aspects, and part of this advantage was also quietly revealed tonight. Li Tianlan decided on tonight's war plan. He tried his best to destroy the Shadow Throne. Now the Shadow Throne was finished. But what was the key? The massive army of Wulan State was the key. Li Tianlan sending letters to all the superpowers was the key. And the intelligence that Prance had penetrated the Shadow Throne in a few words was the most important. If such a woman didn't die, no one would be able to sleep and eat in peace, right? Mellad shook his head in a self-deprecating manner and said softly, "You can leave now, High Priest. We are looking forward to what the Jodl family will do next." Hall nodded and looked up in the direction of the Shadow Throne again. A dark light suddenly lit up in the east where the crowd was surging. The light turned into a dark shadow and slowly spread, like a mist or a curtain. But the mist-like shadow was constantly spreading in the crowd. Vaguely, even the gunshots in that area seemed to have weakened. Melad's and Hall's pupils contracted at the same time, and they said in unison, "Death and wither." The two of them looked at each other. Hall nodded and said in a complicated tone, "King Tong is about to make a breakthrough." A breakthrough. King Tong's ranking on the divine list was not high. It was only in the middle and lower reaches. She was on par with Situ Tangyue, the city governor of Sai City in Zhongzhou State. After her invincible realm stabilized, she knew that she had no hope of reaching the peak of the invincible realm in this life, so she had never considered breaking through. But what she didn't expect was that when the Shadow Throne was about to fall apart, she once again found an opportunity to approach the peak of the invincible realm. She was close to the peak of the invincible realm. This was the standard strength of the top 10 on the divine list. But there was no joy in King Tong's eyes. European martial arts were also broad and profound, and there were also outstanding martial arts in Rothschild. Ice Condensed Tomb and Shadow Kingdom were both well-known unique skills in the Dark World. In King Tong's current state, her most powerful unique skill was the Death and Wither with extremely strange and terrifying lethality. This was not a unique skill that condensed the void with power and then formed a domain to tear the enemy apart. The Death and Wither itself was a domain. And it was a domain that acted on the human body. It was just like the ubiquitous sword intent in the Dark World. But when the sword intent was extremely strong, even a casual breath might be completely shattered by the sword intent in the air. The Death and Wither of King Tong spread very far, and the shadow spread to every corner like fog. The army of Wulan State kept falling down. King Tong moved forward, and so did the black fog. Vaguely, King Tong really saw the next step of her martial arts. It was very clear but also very far away. King Tong's eyes lit up and then dimmed. She had the hope of breaking through, but tonight she was doomed to be hopeless. And in the current situation, even if she succeeded in breaking through, it would be difficult for her to turn the tide. But her Shadow Throne was right in front of her. In any case, she had to give it a try and do her best to take the Shadow Throne out. "Gather!" King Tong suddenly opened her mouth, and her sharp voice instantly cut through the night sky. The elites of the Shadow Throne had changed from a large phalanx to a small one. It hadn't been long since King Tong left, but the elites of the Shadow Throne were still falling one after another in the roar of gunfire. King Tong gritted her teeth and suddenly rushed forward. As the black mist surged forward, an incomparably shrill and ear-piercing scream suddenly rang out. Across the vast sea of people, King Tong couldn't see what was happening in the Shadow Throne, but she could clearly hear whose voice it was. "Poppy!" King Tong's heart sank, and she rushed over frantically. At the same time, the elites of the Shadow Throne, who were struggling in the siege, were also stunned for a moment. In the battle, the figures were intertwined, and the accident was completely abrupt. When Poppy's scream sounded, everyone turned their heads in astonishment and saw a sharp dagger piercing into Poppy's back. It was pulled down from his back in an extremely cruel manner, almost cutting through Poppy's whole body. Owen Tanley stood behind Poppy, holding a knife in his hand, and his body was covered with Poppy's blood. Poppy turned his head with difficulty and looked at Erwin, his eyes confused. However, as a high-level member of the Shadow Throne, Erwin, who had taken the initiative to kill another high-level member, looked calm. He looked into Poppy's eyes quietly, and a fierce light flashed in his eyes. "Do you know," he said softly, "the heir of the Tanlis family that you killed with poison, the only heir of our family in this generation, is my son." His voice was very soft, but he repeated it heavily, "He's my son." The dagger was pulled out from Poppy's back and stabbed into his shoulders again, then his legs, and then his neck. The knife light flashed countless times in just a few seconds. Under the sharp pain, Poppy's beautiful face was completely distorted, but the scream died down the moment it sounded. Blood splattered all over Erwin's face. Owen, who had endured for a long time, was close to going crazy. His eyes turned and fell on the representative of the Johnson family. He sneered and said, "Is this bitch a member of your family? Do you want to collect her body?" The representative of the Johnson family's face suddenly changed, and he said angrily, "What nonsense are you talking about?" Owen laughed crazily. He suddenly lifted Poppy's broken body and threw it into the sky. The dagger in his hand was suddenly raised high, and the knife light filled the air. King Tong's domain suddenly exploded in the air, and the violent domain instantly blasted Erwin away. King Tong caught Poppy's body and fell to the ground. "Erwin, do you know what you're doing?" King Tong's tone was full of rage. Erwin's body fell to the ground and he spat out a mouthful of blood. He spat out a mouthful of saliva, and his eyes were red. He looked at King Tong with presumptuous and resentful eyes and sneered, "You're a bitch like Poppy. Bullsh *T. How dare you kill my son? I'll make you pay the price. The whole Rothschild will pay the price. I'm here to announce that the Tanlis family will withdraw from the Shadow Throne from now on and declare war on Rothschild. We won't stop until one of us is dead. *CKU. You're courting death." King Tong's face suddenly twisted in rage, and she took a step forward. "King Tong, do you know what you're doing?" Another furious voice rang out. The senior member of the Julian family stood in front of Erwin and said in a cold tone, "Are you going to kill all the people in the Shadow Throne?" King Tong suddenly stopped. "You killed the people of the Julian family and the Jodl family. Do you want to destroy the Tanlis family now? Who gave you the right?" The senior member of the Julian family said in a cold tone, "King Tong, most of us are very disappointed in you. I think after tonight, you are no longer worthy of sitting on the throne of the Shadow Throne. If I can return to France, I will unite all the wealthy families in the Shadow Throne and expel you from the Shadow Throne permanently." King Tong was stunned and couldn't say anything for a while. "Do you think you can still go back to your France?" A gentle voice suddenly rang out in the battlefield. It was light, magnetic, and extremely pleasing to the ear. King Tong's body shook violently, and her eyes were filled with surprise. The surrounding space shook violently in a shape visible to the naked eye. The senior member of the Julian family opened his mouth. Just as he was about to speak, the shaking space had directly swallowed him up. The senior member of the Julian family, who had just wanted to expel King Tong from the Shadow Throne, exploded into a cloud of blood mist. A man who looked like a young man or a middle-aged man appeared beside King Tong. The man was tall and straight, handsome, gentle, and quiet, making people feel like they were bathing in the spring breeze. Erwin stared at the man who suddenly appeared. He opened his mouth. In the battlefield that had suddenly become silent, he seemed to use a lot of strength to whisper, "Paul? Paul William Wang Rothschild, the elder brother of the Queen of the Shadow Throne, the current patriarch of the Rothschild family." Paul turned his head and looked at Erwin quietly. Then he looked at the current Shadow Throne. He stood in front of King Tong and suddenly laughed softly. "It seems that many people have forgotten that the Shadow Throne was originally established by Rothschild. And who among you is qualified to expel the people of Rothschild? Who is qualified?" No one spoke. There was silence. Even Erwin fell silent. "In my opinion, there is no need for the current Shadow Throne to exist," Paul said quietly. "King Tong has made mistakes, and so do. But it doesn't matter. From now on, in the name of the Patriarch of Rothschild, I will disband the Shadow Throne. As for the previous grievances, I will wait for you in England. You can come to me at any time. Owen's body suddenly shook, and he stood up subconsciously. Paul waved his hand casually. Bang! Flesh and blood flew everywhere. Owen's body directly exploded into countless pieces. Everyone who saw this scene felt their bodies turn cold. The Patriarch of Rothschild was naturally famous in the Dark World. But there was no information that showed that the Patriarch of Rothschild was an invincible realm expert. Everyone thought that Rothschild only had King Tong. Their Patriarch didn't know martial arts. He didn't know martial arts. Tonight, Paul disbanded the entire Shadow Throne. But Rothschild appeared in the sight of the Dark World in an even more powerful manner. Paul slowly turned around and looked at King Tong. If the indefinite grace were in your hands, everything would be different tonight. Paul tidied up King Tong's blood-stained hair and said in a gentle and calm tone. King Tong nodded and then shook her head. She naturally knew what Paul meant. The ranking of the 12 murderous weapons in the Dark World had always been vague. But there was no dispute that the strongest human emperor was the human emperor. And the ranking of the indefinite grace was second only to that of the human emperor, which was also indisputable. The indefinite grace shocked the Dark World with the fastest shooting speed and the strongest single penetrating power. But it didn't mean that it was useless to these ordinary soldiers. In fact, if King Tong had a spear in her hand, even if the indefinite grace was not strong in group damage, everything tonight was enough for her to easily break out of the encirclement. But she lent the indefinite grace to the Wang family of Beihai. So tonight, the Shadow Throne was torn apart, until Paul appeared, expelled everyone, and officially disbanded the Shadow Throne. Do you regret it? Paul asked with a smile. King Tong shook her head without hesitation. But he didn't come tonight. Paul continued. King Tong hesitated for a moment before asking softly, why? Anyone will make mistakes, and so will he. Tonight he made a mistake. He is still in the office of the president and has been imprisoned by Li Tianlong. Naturally he can't come. How is that possible? King Tong raised her head in surprise. But Paul's expression and tone were still calm. Nothing is impossible. King Tong bit her lip and remained silent. Just admit defeat, okay? Paul touched his sister's hair and said in a gentle tone of negotiation. If they admitted defeat, they would have to accept the failure tonight and leave Eastern Europe. All the interests in Eastern Europe had nothing to do with the Shadow Throne. No, they had nothing to do with Rothschild anymore. King Tong was silent for a long time. Paul looked at her and waited for her answer quietly. The domain of the invincible realm kept shaking around him. Any soldier of Wulan state who rushed up was torn to pieces. As long as King Tong nodded, the two invincible realm experts would break out of the encirclement tonight, and they didn't have to worry about anything anymore. Finally, King Tong nodded. Paul reached out and took her palm, saying calmly, "Let's go home." Chapter 496. 8,000-word chapter. There was no doubt that Reki City was the focus of the Dark World tonight. The Caesar Hotel was the focus of Reki City. In the information age, all the information was transmitted at the speed of a phone call. If one was a little more cautious, it was just a matter of a satellite encrypted phone call. On the evening of August 17th, the military of Wulan state tried its best to besiege the Caesar Hotel, where the Shadow Throne was located. This was not a secret at all. As soon as the war broke out, such explosive news had spread throughout the Dark World. It had been nearly an hour since the war began. All the forces hidden in Reki City who thought they were qualified to play and who tried to fish in troubled waters gathered near the Caesar Hotel at this time. Most people had witnessed the process of the Shadow Throne's dissolution. It seemed to be just a few words, but God knew how much Wulan State, Li Tianlong, or Samsara Palace had to pay to get the top-secret information inside the Shadow Throne. All the major forces had been quietly observing the fighting and division inside the Shadow Throne. After a short period of time, they finally confirmed a fact. Wang Tianzong was really not in the Caesar Hotel. And everything that happened tonight would not be a joint act between the Snowdance Corps, the Wang family of Beihai, and the Shadow Throne. After confirming this fact, everyone saw a huge opportunity in front of them. The Shadow Throne was disbanded. Rothschild, which occupied several developed countries in Europe, lost all the forces around them to protect them. Paul William Wang Rothschild, the current patriarch of Rothschild, who everyone thought did not know martial arts, also revealed the strength of the invincible realm. There was no doubt that this was Rothschild's last trump card. In Reki City, which the Wang family of Beihai could not take care of, they would break Rothschild tonight. In the basement headquarters of the military rear of Wulan State, Qin Shilai, the Dark Sword Master of Eastern Europe, straightened up the moment he saw Paul appear. Prime Minister Riker, who had been standing beside him, took a few steps back subconsciously. He couldn't tell what kind of feeling it was, but he vaguely felt that Qin Shilai seemed to have changed when Paul appeared. Previously, Qin Shilai had been quietly watching the war in front of the Caesar Hotel. He watched General Prance destroy the inner defense line of the Shadow Throne, the fight inside the Shadow Throne and King Tong's choice, and the large number of troops in Wulan State being wiped out. In the Shadow Kingdom and the ice-sealed tomb, King Tong's figure flashed in his sight again and again with blood. Qin Shilai had been silent, calm and gentle, but there was only indifference in his eyes. However, the appearance of the current patriarch of Rothschild, Paul, made him completely focused in an instant. This change was very obvious, and it was getting more and more obvious. He stood there quietly. As time passed, his figure gradually became a sharp sword in Rick's eyes, distant, sharp, deep, and solemn. Qin Shilai squinted at Paul on the screen and remained silent for a long time. I didn't expect His Highness to be telling the truth. He suddenly muttered to himself, his tone somewhat complicated. Li Tianlan's plan tonight was simple but extremely huge. His plan made full use of all the advantages he had accumulated in Wulan State. It was extreme and crazy. The first half of the plan was aimed at the Shadow Throne. The moment Prance stimulated the nerves of the Shadow Throne and the Jodl family withdrew from the Shadow Throne, the plan could be said to have been a success. The middle stage of the plan was aimed at Rothschild. It was not aimed at King Tong. It was aimed at the entire Rothschild. It was Li Tianlan who told him about Paul's strength. He had no intention of destroying this unique financial family in Europe, but he never thought about not destroying it. To be precise, he didn't care. What he wanted was to completely destroy the power of Rothschild in the dark world. King Tong was going to die. Paul was going to die too. He had to die. No country or force in the world dared to underestimate Rothschild. It was a murderous weapon second only to the human emperor. It had 2 experts of the invincible realm. It had a deep foundation. It could cover the sky with one hand in countless fields in Europe. Its wealth was so huge that it was almost beyond the imagination of ordinary wealthy families. In countless fields, Rothschild was a giant beast that could easily devour everything. In recent years, it had drifted away from the Lin clan, and the Qin clan in Eastern Europe had returned to the Lin clan. Rothschild had also become the most important ally of the Wang family of Beihai. And it was a force that drifted away from Zhongzhou State. For Li Tianlan, Rothschild drifted away from Zhongzhou State, which was tantamount to drifting away from the rules. He was no match for Wang Tianzong, far from it. The Li family was no match for the Wang family of Beihai, far from it. If Li Tianlan wanted to survive in the shadow of Wang Tianzong and the Wang family of Beihai, the only thing he could rely on was the rules. The rules were the general trend and position. Li Tianlan was most certain that he and Wang Tianzong both belonged to Zhongzhou State. Under any circumstances, even if he left Eastern Europe, Wang Tianzong would not dare to kill him blatantly. He could only rely on some forces that drifted away from Zhongzhou State. Rothschild was the force that posed the greatest threat to Li Tianlan. As long as Rothschild was destroyed, most of his and Wang Tianzong's power could only be limited to the rules. If Li Tianlan wanted to survive, it would be much easier. Moreover, any force needed a broad foundation to develop. Li Tianlan now had many allies. The Lin clan, the Samsara Palace, the Dark Knights, the Qin clan in Eastern Europe, Sai City, the Dongchen clan, the Jade Pool, Mount Shu, and even the Shadow Sect. This was a huge force that was enough to make anyone look sideways. It was also the biggest capital that Li Tianlan could play with Wang Tianzong within the rules of Zhongzhou state. And his many allies also meant that he needed a lot of development opportunities. If Rothschild was destroyed, there would be a big blank space in the sphere of influence of most developed countries in Europe. England, France, the rising Sun City, Italos, Germany, these were all benefits that Li Tianlan could share with his allies, and even slowly digest by himself. However, with the division of the Shadow Throne, if Rothschild was really destroyed tonight, the Vatican was bound to dominate Europe. As High Priest Hall said, after dispelling the shadow of Europe, the Vatican was bound to spread the glory of God all over the dark world. Therefore, if the medium-term plan succeeded, it would mean that the honeymoon period of the Snowdance Corps and the Vatican's short-term cooperation would be completely torn apart at the beginning. Therefore, the ending plan for the second half would be extremely grand and brilliant. On the screen, Paul and King Tong gave up all the people in the Shadow Throne and moved straight forward. Some experts in the Shadow Throne, who could be regarded as King Tong's trusted subordinates, followed behind the two of them. Paul didn't care about them and didn't expel them, but he wouldn't deliberately wait. The whole night sky was constantly torn apart as he walked. In the deep darkness, the messy rain exploded piece by piece. The void was turbulent and vibrating, and the light was devoured. Paul's figure became more and more blurred. As he walked over, blood splashed everywhere. A large area of the void was constantly solidified, and the whole night sky was dyed with extremely dark colors. Qin Shilai's expression became more and more solemn. After all, Li Tianlan's intelligence made a mistake, a big mistake. According to the intelligence, Paul's current strength was in the invincible realm, but he should not be stronger than King Tong. He was probably in the latter half of the divine list. But in his eyes, how could Paul not be stronger than King Tong? He walked calmly in the crowd against the hail of bullets, stained with blood all the way. Such momentum was much stronger than King Tong's. Even if King Tong made another breakthrough, she would not be stronger than the current Paul. Paul was not at the peak of the invincible realm yet. But vaguely, Qin Shilai could feel that in the whole dark world, Paul might be the invincible realm expert who was closest to the peak of the invincible realm. The sword intent whistled around Qin Shilai and turned into a faint storm. The famous sword cutting edge, which was famous in the dark world, trembled slightly behind him. It seemed to be excited and joyful. Qin Shilai slowly held the hilt of the sword and pulled out the blade. The blade was extremely bright. But in the battle with Jiang Qiansong that day, cutting edge showed some slight cracks because it couldn't bear the sword intent of Li Tianlan and him. Qin Shilai looked at cutting edge in his hand quietly. Cutting edge was flawed, but his eyes were full of deep affection. "Your Highness." Riker couldn't help taking a step forward. He wanted to say something but stopped on second thought. Qin Shilai glanced at him and didn't say anything. "Your Highness, my army can't stop Paul and King Tong," Riker said in a heavy voice. Stopping a team led by an invincible realm expert and stopping an invincible realm expert were two completely different concepts. A team naturally had a stronger combat capability. However, stronger combat power was never used to break out of an encirclement, but to kill. In the crowd, if an invincible realm expert ignored his team, the possibility of success in breaking through the crowd was almost infinite. The most important thing was that they were not only besieging King Tong now, and Paul, an even more powerful Paul, an invincible realm expert who was really infinitely close to the peak of the invincible realm, only half a line away or even less than half a line, was leading King Tong, an invincible realm expert on the divine list. The two of them broke through the encirclement like two ferocious tigers. The surrounding troops of Wulan state were non-entities. Many ants can kill an elephant. That's because elephants are too clumsy. Even if the tiger couldn't beat it, couldn't it run away? Tonight, Wulan state had formed a blood feud with Rothschild. It was an irreconcilable blood feud. After sacrificing so many troops, Riker had no choice but to do his best to destroy Paul and King Tong. At this time, he really hoped that Qin Shilai could come forward to restrain him. Qin Shilai looked at his watch and waited silently. He was still waiting for a call. It was Li Tianlan's call. Li Tianlan's plan was too crazy. If he took action one step earlier or one step later, it might have an irreversible impact on the final outcome. He had to wait for an accurate signal. The phone rang abruptly, and it sounded a little ear-piercing in the silent headquarters. Riker's body trembled. In Qin Shilai's hands, a large number of sword shadows filled with sharpness. He picked up the phone, put it to his ear, and said hello. "Let's do it." Li Tianlan's voice was low and determined. Qin Shilai was silent. There was a huge mistake in the estimation of Paul's strength in the intelligence. He was infinitely close to the peak of the invincible realm, and the invincible realm expert in the second half of the divine list. On paper, there was not much difference between the two realms. This was a small mistake. But in the actual war, this was the most fatal mistake. But it was too late for Li Tianlan to adjust his own plan. "This is a lesson," Li Tianlan said softly. "From now on, I will pay attention." Qin Shilai smiled bitterly. He understood what Li Tianlan meant. Li Tianlan was now in a high position of power, but after all, he was not an old fox who had been struggling in the dark world. His temper was too extreme and crazy, so he subconsciously did not leave any room for himself. Now all his strength had been used to the extreme. A slight change would affect the whole body. There was no possibility of change. So even if there was a fatal mistake in the estimation of Paul's strength, the plan could not be stopped. Let's do it. He could only do it. Qin Shilai suddenly clenched the sharpness in his hand and said calmly, "I'm going now." For all the dark forces, Paul's sudden appearance in Reki City was a complete accident. And Paul's strength was even more of an accident. In Reki City, the military of Wulan State was still desperately moving forward. But Paul, with his golden eyes, seemed to ignore everything. He walked in a straight line. He rushed forward. There was no detour, no dodging. The void, which was distorted to the extreme, vibrated without stopping. A large amount of blood and bones flew all over the sky. The soldiers of Wulan State suffered more and more casualties, but Paul's expression was always calm, and the domain around him was always stable. At this moment, the Patriarch of Rothschild, who had endured for many years and kept a low profile, completely shocked the whole dark world. In the church in the west of the city, Arsis, the commander of the Holy Disarmament Corps of the Vatican, watched this scene quietly through the screen with a solemn and gloomy expression. The heavy rain outside the window kept falling with the thunder, but in Arisis's eyes, there was only Paul on the screen. Angel, the Holy Virgin of the Vatican, stood beside Arsis in a veil. She was silent for a long time before sighing softly. "Rothschild is really scary. It's because he's scary that we can't let him live." Arsis calmed down and said in a calm voice, "Tonight is an opportunity." Angel did not speak. Arsis paused and continued, "If possible, I will take Paul down myself." Angel glanced at him. Under the white veil, her eyes were clear, but she frowned slightly. Arsis took a deep breath. Obviously, he was ready to fight with all his might. He was a real expert at the peak of the invincible realm. The Lin clan was hidden from the world. Before the appearance of the Purgatory of Heaven capital, Arisis's strength in the dark world could be said to be second only to the Sword Emperor Wang Tianzong. His peak of the invincible realm was extremely stable, without any exaggeration. So he was the top expert in Europe. Now his position as the top expert in Europe was also stable. But Paul was infinitely close to his current level. Maybe it was just half a step, maybe it was just a small half step, and Paul would be on par with him. Arsis suddenly had a deep sense of crisis. Rothschild and the Shadow Throne could be said to be the biggest opponents of the Vatican. For many years, the Vatican had been silently encroaching on Rothschild's domain. This movement was very slow, but the Vatican was not in a hurry. After all, it was difficult for Rothschild to support the overall situation alone with King Tong. There was plenty of time for them to slowly lay out the plan. But tonight, Paul, who was infinitely close to Arsis, appeared. Arcis was horrified. With Paul's strength, Rothschild could be said to be full of confidence. Over the years, when the Vatican had been silently plotting against Rothschild, who could be sure that Rothschild had not done something in secret? The more he thought about it, the more uneasy he felt. He knew how terrifying Rothschild was. He also knew that it was impossible for Rothschild not to do anything. But the problem was that the Vatican didn't see what Rothschild had done. Just because they couldn't see it didn't mean that it didn't exist. The most terrible thing was that they couldn't see it. Looking at Paul on the screen, the light in Arcis's eyes kept flickering, and finally turned into the most naked, killing, intent, and fierce light. "No," Angel suddenly said. Arcis frowned and glanced at Angel. His eyes were a little blank, and he thought it was strange. What did she mean by no? "You won't kill Paul." Angel hesitated for a moment and finally said it herself. Arcis was not angry. He just said calmly, "I don't understand what the Holy Virgin means. If Paul dies here, do you know what it means?" Angel looked straight into Arcis's eyes. Arcis nodded, and his eyes became calmer and calmer. "It means that we can sweep away all the forces of Rothschild in the shortest time. It means that we will become the unique and supreme force in all of Europe. It means that the strength of the Vatican will expand to be close to the time when the great Pope of Monlier controlled the Vatican." He looked at Angel and whispered, "Don't you want to see such a result, Your Highness the Holy Virgin?" His voice was steady, but there was a touch of undisguised sarcasm in his eyes. Angel was the Holy Virgin of the Vatican. Arcis was the commander of the Holy Disarmament Corps. To the outside world, the Vatican had always claimed that Arcis was the Saint War Angel of the Vatican. But the status of the Saint War Angel was still slightly lower than that of the Holy Virgin. It was just that this difference in status had been reduced to almost non-existent under the vague attitude of the Pope many times. The Saint War Angel and the Holy Virgin were not on good terms. This was not a secret among the higher-ups of the Vatican. However, although the relationship between the two was bad, it was not to the point of life and death. Otherwise, the Holy Disarmament Corps would not have come to Eastern Europe with the Holy Punishment Priest Group. "The future is beautiful, but these are all your imagination. I don't deny that everything you said is possible, but that's in the future," Angel said calmly. Angel said calmly. Her voice was crisp and soft. "God said that the future is tomorrow." Arcis had a proud look on his face. Angel glanced at him. Her eyes were calm, but there was a touch of something else in them. "Tomorrow? Are you sure you can live to see tomorrow after killing Paul?" Arcis frowned, snorted fiercely, and said gloomily, "I don't understand what you mean." "You seem to have forgotten." Angel said softly, "Who split the Shadow Alliance tonight and even forced Paul out?" "Li Tianlan?" Arcis raised his eyebrows. "What can he do?" "It is said that he was seriously injured in the battle with Jiang Qiansong. Now that he has woken up, how much combat power can he keep? Even if he is in his heyday, what is he? In your eyes, Li Tianlan himself may be nothing, but don't forget that he now controls the entire Wulan state and the Snowdance Corps, the most elite army in the world." Angel said coldly. Arcis was silent for a while. Only Angel's voice sounded in the hall of the church. "Did Li Tianlan create everything today for us to take advantage of? Your Highness Ars, I don't deny that your vision just now is very beautiful, but Li Tianlan will also think of what you think. This is Reki City, a place where even Wang Tianzong can be imprisoned. We can forget about other things, but here, Li Tianlan is the most powerful force. Li Tianlan destroyed the Shadow Throne. He and his allies around him are undoubtedly interested in the development opportunities of the developed countries in Europe. If you kill Paul and King Tong, the Shadow Throne will be torn apart, and Rothschild will disappear. Do you think Li Tianlan will watch us become the largest force in Europe? Or even become his strongest opponent after entering Eastern Europe?" Arcis understood what Angel meant, but he was a little uncertain. He sneered and said, "Do you mean that if I kill Paul and King Tong, Li Tianlan will dare to attack me?" "He will attack the Vatican without hesitation," Angel said with great certainty. Arcis asked if he dared to do it. Angel answered whether he would or would not. For the young madman who dared to imprison Wang Tianzong, Angel really didn't think that there was anything he didn't dare to do. Paul must not be touched. I know that he is very powerful, but it is precisely because he is powerful that we need to keep him alive. You can kill King Tong tonight and leave Paul, who is a strong deterrent, behind. Angel's voice was almost in order. You can seriously injure Paul, but he must be alive. Our cooperation with the Snowdance Corps is now in the honeymoon period. After tonight, we can take over the theocracy of the 5 countries in Eastern Europe with Wulan State as the center. This is an area very suitable for the development of fanatics. The more believers we have, the stronger our power will be. As for Paul, we can let him leave Eastern Europe with serious injuries. King Tong has fallen, the Shadow Throne has split, and Rothschild has suffered heavy losses. When we have digested the interests of Eastern Europe, it will be a good time to break up with the Snowdance Corps. At that time, we will destroy Rothschild, and naturally, we won't have to worry about Li Tianlan. This is the best choice. Kill Paul tonight? I'm sure that as long as you dare to do it, you won't be able to leave Reki City. Arcis glanced at him, expressionless. Arcis can leave Reki City. Angel, you can also leave. The screen playing the war in front of the Caesar Hotel suddenly paused, and then the picture jumped. An old man in a white robe and holding a scepter appeared on the screen. His smile was calm and deep. Your Majesty! Arcis and Angel bowed at the same time. The Pope, dressed in a white robe, narrowed his eyes, glanced at Angel, and took a step forward. In the sight of Angel and Arcis, the Pope, who was thousands of miles away, seemed to step out of the screen and stand in front of the two of them. Arcis and Angel's bodies drooped lower and lower. Especially Angel, her whole body seemed to be trembling slightly. Arcis gave her a strange look. As the Holy Virgin, whose status in the Vatican was second only to the Pope, Angel should have played a role that could check and balance the Pope in some ways. However, Angel would inadvertently show extreme fear of the Pope on any occasion, and she would listen to the Pope's orders. As a result, the Pope became the real emperor in the entire Vatican. He could cover the sky with one hand, and his words carried enormous weight. As a result, the Vatican style of doing things over the years had become more and more aggressive, and there was even a tendency to move closer to the super dark forces. Angel. The Pope's voice sounded gentle and calm. Your thoughts are reasonable. But do you really have such thoughts for the sake of the Church? Angel's delicate body shook violently. She lowered her head and said in a trembling voice, Your Majesty, I don't understand what you mean. You and I can both see Li Tianlan's plan. Paul's appearance surprised everyone. Now the strength he has shown has exceeded everyone's imagination. Arcis is now in the strongest state after being crowned. He can kill Paul without paying too much of a price. Are you really stopping him for the Vatican? Your Majesty, Rothschild still has infinite grace. Angel's voice was very low, like a whisper. Infinite grace has been lent to the Wang family of Beihai by King Tong. As the Holy Virgin of the Holy Punishment Priest Group, didn't High Priest Hall report to you? The Pope's voice was cold and light. Death Aria is in the charging period, but infinite grace is also not in Rothschild. Paul doesn't have a murderous weapon. If Arcis kills him, his injury won't be too serious. In this state, Arcis still has the ability to take you out of Reki City. At worst, what we give up is nothing more than some saint warriors and holy punishment priests. Even Mellad may take advantage of the chaos to escape after the coronation. We will fall out with Li Tianlan, but cooperation is not eternal. The plan can't keep up with the changes. After Rothschild is destroyed, the whole of Western Europe, and even the whole of Europe, will be ours in the future. So what if we give up Eastern Europe for the time being? In order not to fall out with Li Tianlan, we limit ourselves to a few small countries in Eastern Europe. Who is putting the cart before the horse? Your Majesty, Angel forced herself to calm down. You can't underestimate Li Tianlan. I admit that he may become the chosen one in the future, but the premise is that he survives. Right now, he is not qualified for me to pay attention to him. His Snowdance Corps is very strong. I am willing to give up all the saint warriors in Eastern Europe. As long as the three of you can come back, we will win. We can give up the interests of Eastern Europe for the time being. Angel, do you have anything else to say? Angel felt powerless inside. In the end, the Pope made a mistake that perhaps all the big shots would make. The whole dark world knew that Li Tianlan was rising and was the future chosen one. The whole dark world called Li Tianlan His Highness. But no real big shot was willing to give Li Tianlan enough respect. The reason was simple. Li Tianlan was too young. People might pay attention to a 22-year-old highness on the surface, but in their bones, no one would really pay much attention to him. Such an idea was rooted in the hearts of every big shot. Even they themselves did not know that they would have such an attitude towards Li Tianlan. What would happen if they despised Li Tianlan? Jiang Qianyan despised Li Tianlan and died. Black Ghost despised Li Tianlan and died. Jiang Qiansong despised Li Tianlan, and the Jiang family of South America suffered heavy losses. Jiang Qiansong was even expelled from the Jiang family of South America. His whereabouts were unknown, and no one knew whether he was dead or alive. King Tong also despised Li Tianlan. If it weren't for Wang Tianzong's protection, King Tong would have died in the date of death 10 days ago. Wang Tianzong also despised Li Tianlan. Now the Sword Emperor was imprisoned in the office of the president. And now, the Pope also despised Li Tianlan. Because he was really too young. Angel didn't know what to say, so she could only repeat again, Li Tianlan is not so simple. Rothschild is not so simple either. The Pope took a deep look at her and said blandly, Angel, what you said makes sense, but you don't understand the horror of Rothschild. Paul's life is a bomb for the whole Vatican. The bomb must be dismantled. You have your reasons and I have my choices. Now, you must carry out my orders, cooperate with Arcis and kill Paul. Angel was silent for a long time without saying a word. The Pope suddenly said, You don't want to kill Paul because you don't want to fall out with the Snowdance Corps too soon, right? Angel's body trembled, and she continued to be silent. You don't want to fall out with the Snowdance Corps for the Vatican? Or for yourself? The Pope's voice became more and more erratic. Angel, do you want to see him? Angel bit her lips so hard that her delicate red lips bled from the bite. Selfish. The Pope said calmly. His voice suddenly expanded, as if it had spread to the whole world. His loud and majestic voice occupied all of Angel's consciousness. Selfishness is a sin. Angel's body suddenly shook, and she subconsciously knelt in front of the Pope. The Pope looked down at Angel. After a long silence, he suddenly asked, Angel, where am I? He was in front of Angel, but he came out of the screen. The real Pope was still on the screen, thousands of miles away. You're in front of me. Angel replied naturally. So you still can't see through me? The Pope's voice was a little disappointed. He suddenly thought of a woman who even he felt extremely amazing. If it's Qin Weibai, she will see through everything I'm doing now. Angel lowered her head and said nothing. So in fact, she is more suitable to be the Holy Virgin of the Vatican than you. The Pope said, both in spirit and image. Angel continued to be silent. The Pope sighed softly and said slowly, Unfortunately, she is no longer a virgin. Qin Weibai was Li Tianlan's woman. This was something that the whole dark world knew. It was also a cruel fact that made countless experts in the dark world feel heartbroken. Angel's face suddenly turned pale. Under the veil, there was no trace of blood on her face. The Pope took a deep look at Angel and did not speak. His temperament was gentle, but a fierce light suddenly flashed in his eyes. It was like the light of a beast, violent, cruel, crazy, and disgusted. This fierce light was so bright and so obscure, like the wind and rain in the outside world at night, or like a precursor. You're tuning in to the Wang Lin's Journey YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.